Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep, but before you close your eyes, I have a little favor to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin. It was one of those crisp, clear autumn afternoons where the light seemed a little too bright and the wind carried a hint of something cold and ancient in it, a smell like dust and forgotten things. That afternoon, the air itself felt pregnant with anticipation, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Maggie, Danny, Sarah, and Lucas had been friends since childhood, bound by a quiet but unshakable bond that had carried them from the raucous days of adolescence into the quiet drudgery of adulthood. They were the kind of friends who could sit in silence for hours, and when they did speak, their words were filled with the kind of knowing familiarity that only comes from years of shared history. Their weekends were often spent wandering through the abandoned places of the city, poking around flea markets, junk shops, and the occasional yard sale. They were the kind of people who found beauty in the forgotten, the discarded. That Saturday was no different. They had gathered in a small, run-down market on the outskirts of town, a place that hadn't changed in years, where the tables were lined with strange trinkets, half-broken toys, and stacks of old vinyl records. The scent of old leather and musty wood hung thick in the air, and the vendors' voices echoed through the maze of booths, each one trying to outshout the other in a desperate bid to sell whatever oddities they had on display. But it was Lucas who found it first. The camera was hidden among a pile of yellowing magazines and antique books. Its weathered leather case was cracked and worn, the kind of thing you might expect to find in a haunted attic, a relic from a time long gone. The moment Lucas saw it, something strange stirred inside him, an instinctual pull that he couldn't quite explain. He picked it up, dusted it off, and held it in his hands. It was old, very old, and yet, for some reason, it felt heavy, almost alive, like it was waiting for someone to notice it. "Hey, look at this," he called to the others, his voice tinged with excitement. Maggie, Sarah, and Danny walked over. They had already picked through a few other stalls, but something about this camera seemed different. It wasn't the first time they had seen something old and interesting in a market like this, but this time it was different. "It looks ancient," Sarah remarked, her fingers brushing over the lens. "Do you think it still works?" "I don't know," Lucas said, turning it over in his hands. "It's got that old-timey look to it, though. I mean, who uses cameras like this anymore? It's got to be at least 50 years old." The vendor, an elderly man with hunched shoulders and a long white beard, looked over at them from behind the counter. His eyes were dull, the color of fading ash, and his face was lined with wrinkles that seemed to tell a story none of them wanted to hear. "Is it for sale?" Lucas asked, feeling a flicker of unease in his chest. The man's gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. $2, the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. "It's not much, but it's a special camera. One of a kind, really." Lucas glanced at his friends, who shrugged. It wasn't like they had anything else to do, and the price was next to nothing. They weren't really looking for anything in particular that day, but something about the camera tugged at him. The air around it felt strange, electric almost, as if it were alive with the kind of energy that only the forgotten could muster. "I'll take it," Lucas said, pulling out a crumpled bill from his wallet. The vendor smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was one of those smiles that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, as if the man knew something the rest of them didn't. He handed the camera over, and as Lucas took it, their fingers brushed together. For a brief moment, the old man's fingers lingered against Lucas's skin, cold as ice. He quickly pulled his hand back, but the sensation of those fingers stayed with him, sinking deep into his bones. "That'll be $2, the man repeated, his voice softer now. Lucas paid and walked away, still shaken by that cold touch, but trying to dismiss it. The camera was old, probably used, but it was just a camera. Nothing more, nothing supernatural about it. They found a bench outside the market, a small, weather-worn thing with peeling paint. It faced a narrow alleyway that seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into shadows. The wind kicked up again, rattling a few dead leaves across the pavement. Maggie sat down first, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "What's the point of buying something like this?" she asked. "I mean, it's just an old camera. Is there even film for it anymore?" "I think it'll be fun," Lucas replied, the words coming more easily than he expected. "It's vintage, you know. We'll take some pictures. Why not? Maybe we'll get something cool." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I don't know," Lucas said with a grin. "Something out of the ordinary. Maybe we'll catch a ghost on film." They laughed, but the laugh was hollow, like they were trying to convince themselves of something. They didn't know it yet, but something was already set in motion. The camera was already changing the course of their lives, shifting the path under their feet like a strange, unseen hand. After a few moments of hesitation, they decided to take it for a test run. They walked to the park, a nearby patch of green where they could have some fun. It wasn't much, just an old stone fountain in the middle, surrounded by worn-out benches and towering oak trees that seemed too still in the crisp autumn air. Lucas loaded the film, slowly, carefully, before handing the camera to Danny. "You go first. Take a picture of the fountain." Danny took the camera, looking through the viewfinder. His fingers brushed the lens, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to grow still. It wasn't like the world had paused, but the air itself had become a little too thick, like the space around them was shrinking. He snapped the photo and they waited for the sound of the shutter. But when it came, it was almost too loud, too abrupt, like something important had just happened. "Your turn," Danny said, handing the camera to Sarah. The photo was taken. Then another, and another. They posed in front of the fountain, smiling, making faces, laughing with the kind of carefree joy that only young adults could muster. But even as they laughed, a strange unease began to settle over them, a whisper at the back of their minds, like a faint tickle at the edges of their thoughts. Something was wrong, but none of them could put their finger on it. It wasn't until later, when they gathered around in Lucas's living room to develop the film, that they began to notice it. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of something odd. In the first photo, taken in front of the fountain, there was a pair of eyes, barely visible, lurking in the background, a shadow among the shadows. At first, they all thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection or a glare. But when they looked at the next photo, and the one after that, they saw it again. A pair of eyes watching them. Every photo, every frame of film was the same. The eyes were there in the background, always watching, always waiting. And as they flipped through the pictures, it became clear the eyes were getting closer. The presence in the background wasn't just there anymore, it was moving toward them.
But who, or what, was it? The laughter faded as the last photo developed, and the room fell into an unnatural silence. The smell of the chemical solution mixed with the stale air of Lucas's living room, but none of them could focus on that now. Their eyes were glued to the photographs scattered on the table before them. Maggie leaned forward first, her fingers trembling as she picked up the first photo from the top of the pile. The moment she saw it, her face paled, and she quickly set it down again. It was subtle at first, just a slight disturbance, a shadow in the background, where there shouldn't have been anything. But as her eyes moved to the next picture, and the next, the unease crawled deeper into her bones. There was no denying it. "There's something in these photos," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper, as though saying it aloud would make it real. She held up the second picture, the one where they had all posed in front of the fountain, grinning like fools, carefree and unaware of the creeping horror that had quietly found its way into their lives. In the background of that photo, near the edge of the fountain, there were eyes. Not a face, just eyes, dark and hollow, gazing from the shadows. Eyes that had no right being there, eyes that weren't a reflection. "What the hell is that?" Danny asked, his voice low, his words coming out in a tight, strained rush. He took the next photo from the stack and examined it. The eyes were closer now, unmistakable, clearer, sharper, and they were moving, inching toward them. He turned to look at Lucas, who was still holding the camera, the object of all their discomfort. The camera seemed heavier now, as though it were absorbing the weight of their growing fear. I don't know," Lucas said, his voice shaking as he set the camera down, a strange unease bubbling up inside him. He hadn't felt it when they bought the camera, hadn't noticed it at all when they had started snapping pictures. But now, in the silence of his living room, it felt as if the room itself were breathing, and every breath was just a little too shallow, just a little too cold. "I'm telling you, I don't remember anyone being behind us when we were taking those photos," Maggie said, her voice tense. She was trying to remain rational, trying to push down the panic that was threatening to swallow her whole. But as the photos continued to stack up and the eyes kept getting closer, something inside her screamed that they weren't dealing with a random glitch of light or shadow. Something was watching them. Something was there, waiting. "I know," Sarah said softly, as though speaking the truth would make it more real. She turned another photo over in her hands. The eyes in the background were now so close they could be seen clearly, too clearly, and they weren't just eyes anymore. They were alive. There was a malevolence to them, a dark energy that sent a shiver down her spine. But what was worse was that no matter how hard she looked, she couldn't make out who or what those eyes belonged to. There was no body, no face, no other features, just eyes. And they were staring directly at them with an intensity that felt wrong. "I don't like this," Danny said, his voice cracking as he leaned back in his chair, trying to make himself small, to hide from the growing terror that was closing in on them. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Lucas suggested, trying to sound confident, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. But the attempt was futile. The photos didn't lie. The eyes were there, and they were getting closer with every shot. "Maybe," Maggie said, though her voice had already lost its conviction, "maybe we're just imagining things, but look at the last one." She handed over the last photo where the eyes were right there, glaring at them from behind the stone fountain, now close enough to touch. And it wasn't just the eyes. They seemed to be moving on their own. The figure that belonged to those eyes was invisible, but the eyes themselves, the eyes were no longer mere shadows. They were living, breathing, watching. There was a coldness in the air now, a tangible chill that seemed to crawl beneath their skin. It was as if the house, once warm with the familiarity of friends and shared history, had turned into something foreign, something unfamiliar. The walls seemed to be pressing in, the light from the street lamps outside now dimming, casting long shadows across the room. "That's it," Lucas said, standing up abruptly as though he could shake the creeping dread from his body. "I'm going to burn the film. This is messed up. We're just freaking ourselves out." "No," Sarah said, her voice desperate. She grabbed his arm before he could reach the trash can. "We have to figure this out. We can't just pretend it's nothing. We need to know what's going on. Who or what is in those pictures?" "I don't care what's in the damn pictures," Danny snapped. "I'm not sticking around to find out. I say we forget about it. Burn the pictures, burn the camera, and never think about it again." Maggie watched them argue, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind racing. Her gaze fell on the photos again, the eyes staring back at her, unblinking. They were growing closer, more defined with each frame, each photograph. And there was something else, a sense of movement, as though the presence was shifting, like it was waiting to make its move. "We need to leave," Maggie finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of us, right now." But just as she spoke, the room seemed to freeze, the air thickening like the calm before a storm. It was then that they heard it. Distant at first, barely audible over the crackling of the heater in the corner, but unmistakable. A sound, a whisper. It wasn't coming from the photos, it wasn't coming from any of them. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere that they couldn't see, somewhere they couldn't touch. And in that moment, each of them realized with a sickening certainty. The eyes were not just in the photographs. They were here. They were in the room with them. The whispering grew louder, closer, but it wasn't the whispering that frightened them the most. It was the fact that as they listened, they realized that the voice wasn't speaking. It was calling their names. Maggie, Danny, Lucas, Sarah. Each name soft and low, as though it were being whispered directly into their minds. The voice slithered through their thoughts like an insidious presence that was worming its way into their very souls. For the first time that night, they all understood what had been growing in the background of those photos, inching closer with every frame. It was not just a trick of light. It was not some illusion or misstep of the camera. The eyes weren't just watching, they were waiting for something, waiting for them. The room seemed to collapse inward on itself as the whispered voices filled the air, curling around them like smoke, slipping into their thoughts, tightening the grip of dread that had already taken hold of their hearts. Each of them stood frozen, their faces pale, eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound that wasn't supposed to exist, because this wasn't something you could explain away. There was no rationalizing it. There was only the slow realization that whatever had been lurking in those photographs had found a way to cross over into their world. Maggie, the voice came again, softer this time, like a faint breath against her ear. But it wasn't her name alone. It was all of them, each name following the other, slipping in and out of their thoughts like fingers brushing against their consciousness, beckoning, pleading. Maggie's skin crawled. Her heartbeat was a steady thud in her ears, each pulse louder than the last. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled up in the terror that now gripped her. She didn't know what to say. What could you say when the world as you knew it was unraveling right in front of you? Where is it coming from? Danny's voice was tight, his eyes darting around the room, scanning the shadows like a man lost in a nightmare. This isn't possible. I don't know, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched the photo of the fountain in her hand like it was a lifeline. But the eyes in the background were no longer just eyes. They had grown, expanded, staring at them with an intensity that felt like it could burn through their skin. And now, In the silence that followed the whispers, they realized what they had overlooked. There was something more in the photographs, something they hadn't seen before. The eyes weren't just eyes anymore. They had shifted. The shadows around them seemed to move, stretching like dark tendrils. But it wasn't just the shadows. It was them, those eyes, growing, becoming more defined in each photograph. In every frame, the figure in the background was beginning to take shape. It wasn't just a presence. It wasn't a trick of light or an optical illusion. Something was there. Something was taking form, creeping closer, and it was drawing nearer to them with every moment that passed. Lucas was the first to snap out of his stupor, instinctively grabbing the photos off the table, flipping through them with trembling hands. But as he did, the unease that had once hovered over them now seemed to turn into something tangible, something that pressed down on his chest, made his breathing shallow. He wanted to deny it, to throw the camera away and pretend it was all just some sick joke. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a joke. Each photo, each picture was proof. They were no longer dealing with shadows in the background. They were dealing with a presence that had followed them home. And worse, that presence seemed to be growing in strength. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Lucas choked out. His voice was thick with disbelief, with a terror that was now beginning to feel all too real. "Seeing what?" Maggie said, her voice shaky. She felt her pulse hammering in her throat as she stepped closer to Lucas. Her eyes locked onto the photographs once more. There was no mistaking it now. The figure had begun to take form. At first, it had been vague, just a pair of eyes in the darkness, flickering at the edge of the picture. But now the eyes were growing, widening, until there was something more, something wrong, stretching out in the background. It wasn't a shadow anymore. There was something human about it. No, it wasn't human, but it was trying to be. The eyes in each picture were now surrounded by something more substantial. A shape, an outline, something flesh-like, but not quite. It didn't have a face, not yet, but that figure was beginning to solidify into something far more terrifying. They could feel it now, could almost see the way the eyes seemed to track them, each photograph capturing a moment, a snapshot, and drawing them closer to whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted from them. Did you see it move?" Sarah gasped, her hand trembling as she pointed to the photo Lucas was holding. The figure wasn't still. It wasn't frozen in time. It shifted. "Impossible," Lucas whispered. But even as he said it, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, a coldness creeping into his bones. It wasn't impossible. It was happening. Right now. "I think we should get rid of it," Danny said, his voice low, strained. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table, like he was trying to hold himself together, trying to keep himself from falling apart. "You mean the camera?" Maggie asked. Her mind was racing. Everything felt like it was spinning out of control, and the words she needed to say, the logical things, the things that could make this stop, none of them seemed to exist anymore. "Just throw it away?" "Yes," Danny said, his eyes frantic. "It's the camera. It's gotta be. We just burn the damn thing. Get rid of the film. Get rid of it all. Whatever's in there, whatever's following us. We can't..." Suddenly the camera on the table shifted. It was so subtle, so quiet that it might have been missed if they weren't all staring at it so intently. But Maggie saw it. She saw the way it seemed to move, to settle more firmly into place, like it was making itself comfortable, as if it had been waiting all this time for them to act. And that was when she understood. The camera wasn't an object. It wasn't something to be discarded. It was a doorway between this world and another. The realization crashed over her, and it was like ice water slamming into her chest. She stood trembling as the weight of it hit her. This wasn't just about a cursed object or a strange coincidence. This was something else. The eyes weren't a trick of light. They weren't some reflection or optical illusion. They were real, and whatever was behind them, whatever had been following them through every photo, was here, in their world. The whispering voices, they weren't just in the photos either. They were in the room with them, drifting through the air, faint but undeniable. I don't think we can get rid of it, Maggie said, her voice unsteady as she took a step back. She looked at the others, each of them pale, wide-eyed, staring back at her like they had seen a ghost. And maybe they had. What the hell does that mean? Danny snapped, his voice cracking. We can't just sit here and wait for it to eat us. Lucas swallowed hard, staring at the photos in his hands, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure in the background. It was closer now, the eyes locked onto him, watching him with a predatory intensity that made his stomach turn. His hands shook as he dropped the photos onto the table, suddenly feeling sick to his core. He could feel the weight of it, the presence behind those eyes, bearing down on him like 1,000 unseen hands. He felt it in his chest, the way it crushed the air from his lungs. They're getting closer, Sarah whispered. No, Lucas whispered back, a tremor in his voice. It's not just the photos, it's us. It's coming for us. And just as the last word left his mouth, the room seemed to fall silent, the very air thickening with tension. The presence, whatever it was, had shifted, had moved. It was no longer hiding in the background. It was already here. The silence in the room was suffocating, a pressure that pressed down on them like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. The air felt wrong, thick and unyielding, as though it were no longer just the walls of Lucas's apartment that surrounded them, but something else. Something dark and suffocating, stretching out from the very edges of their vision. The presence from the photos wasn't hidden anymore. It was here, among them, and it was watching. Maggie felt a strange sensation creeping down her spine, like icy fingers brushing against her skin. She could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent, calling their names, tugging at her thoughts like a fishing line pulling her underwater. Maggie, Sarah, Luca, Danny. The voices slithered in and out of her mind, growing louder, more insistent, until they seemed to echo in the corners of the room, pressing in on them from all sides. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in, the very air thickening around her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't breathe. Make it stop, she gasped, the words coming out strangled. Please make it stop. I'm trying, Lucas said, his voice strained. His hand was trembling as it hovered over the camera, as though he wanted to destroy it, to throw it away, to burn it. But every time he reached for it, something stopped him. Some invisible force, a pull that he couldn't explain. The camera sat on the table, lifeless, still, but somehow its presence was heavier than ever. The shutter was closed, the lens black, but to Lucas it might as well have been an open doorway into another world, into the wrong world. I don't think we can get rid of it, Danny said, his voice low, almost defeated, but there was a tremor in his words, something primal in the tone. It's already in here, it's in our heads, it's everywhere. The eyes in the photographs, they hadn't just moved, they had changed. The figure in the background had solidified into something inhuman, something grotesque. The eyes were no longer merely shadows. They had become living eyes, eyes that glowed faintly in the dark corners of each picture. Eyes that watched them, followed them wherever they went. The last photo, the one that had been taken just before they had left the park, was now the most disturbing. It was the one where they had been laughing, unaware, their smiles wide and carefree. The figure was now standing directly behind them, no longer an indistinct blur, but a dark shape, tall, thin, and too perfectly still. It didn't have a face, not yet. The eyes were glaring at them, gleaming in the dim light like twin pinpricks of hunger. "I'm not staying here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She was trembling now, her hands pressed against her temples, as though trying to block out the whispers. "I don't want to be anywhere near this thing." But just as she turned toward the door, a sudden, deafening crack echoed through the room, making them all jump. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and then, in the center of the room, the air seemed to warp, distort, like a dark ripple running through the fabric of reality itself. It was as though something was coming through. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Maggie could see her breath puffing out in front of her, thin tendrils of cold mist escaping her lips. Her skin went numb, but it wasn't the kind of numbness that came from cold. It was something deeper, a hollow kind of numbness, like something had touched her soul and frozen it. "It's coming." Lucas's voice broke the silence, his words barely more than a rasp. Maggie whipped around, her heart racing, but there was nothing in the room that she could see. The walls were still, the shadows still lingering in the corners, waiting. But she felt it, the pressure, the weight of something moving just beyond their sight, something shifting in the darkness. The camera, still sitting on the table, was suddenly no longer an object. It was a symbol, it was a doorway, a passage, an invitation. And the more they stared at it, the more it became clear. The thing in the photos, the figure with the eyes, wasn't just watching them. It was calling them. It was reaching into their world, pulling them toward it. Get out now!" Danny shouted, his voice rising in panic. He rushed toward the door, his hand on the handle, but when he twisted it, it was locked. He pulled again, his breath coming in harsh gasps, but the door didn't budge. It was as if the room itself had shifted, trapping them inside. "No," Sarah moaned, her hand flying to her mouth as she stumbled back from the door. No. She was shaking now, her face twisted in fear, and her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Lucas grabbed the camera, his fingers numb as he lifted it from the table. It was heavy, impossibly heavy, and for a moment he wondered if it was the weight of their collective fear, pressing down on him, making it unbearable. But there was something else too, a pull, as though the camera were reaching out to him. He felt a strange compulsion to lift it, to hold it close, but just as his fingers wrapped around the strap, something whispered in his ear. "Do you really think you can stop me?" The voice was soft, almost a caress, but the chill that ran down Lucas's spine was enough to freeze his blood. He spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing behind him. The room was empty, save for the flickering shadows. Yet the voice had come from inside him, from within his mind, as if the very thoughts he was having were being twisted and distorted. "No one escapes." The words slithered into his thoughts, wrapping around them like a vice, squeezing tighter, pulling him under. His grip on the camera tightened, his vision blurring as the shadows around him seemed to shift, no longer simply fading into the corners of the room, but taking shape. "Lucas," Sarah whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Her face was pale, drawn with terror, and she looked at him as though he were already gone, as though he were already consumed. "Put it down, you have to—" But her words were lost in the air, drowned out by the oppressive presence that had filled the room. The shadows were no longer just shapes, no longer just moving corners. They were alive, twisting, curling toward them like dark, hungry snakes. We're not alone," Maggie said, her voice small, her hands shaking as she clutched her chest. The weight of what they were dealing with was starting to settle over her, like a shroud, like a fog that couldn't be shaken off. The eyes, they were everywhere now, watching them from all directions, from every photograph, from every dark corner of the room. And Lucas, still holding the camera, was the focus. The eyes, they weren't just waiting anymore, they were coming. The shadows in the room had become alive, twisting and bending like an oppressive force that couldn't be contained. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Lucas felt the weight of it pressing down on him, drowning him in a sense of helplessness. He still held the camera, its strap cutting into his fingers, as if it were trying to pull him into itself, pulling him toward the darkness that now seemed to swallow the room. The eyes from the photos, they were real. They were no longer just behind the lens. They were right here, right now, and they wanted something. Maggie's voice, weak and strained, cut through the suffocating silence. "Lucas, please, put it down. It's not worth it. Whatever this is, we can't fight it." Lucas didn't respond. He couldn't. The whispers were in his mind, louder now, the voices of the shadows crawling under his skin like insects, burrowing into his thoughts. He could feel them, creeping into his soul, their presence becoming more tangible, more real, with each passing second. The camera, once an innocent relic, now felt like the gateway to something far darker. And he was holding it. He was the one holding it. He was... "Lucas!" Sarah shouted, her voice rising with panic, her footsteps rapid as she approached him, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, you have to fight it. We can still get out of here." But Lucas wasn't sure he could anymore. His hands were shaking, the camera now seeming to pulse in his grip, as though it had a life of its own. The figure behind them, the eyes that had been merely a hint in the background of their photographs, were no longer just watching. They were moving, and their hunger was palpable, suffocating, gnawing at him from the inside. He wanted to drop the camera. He wanted to throw it across the room and burn it, destroy it, erase it from existence. But when he tried, his fingers locked around the strap. The camera wouldn't let go. It was like it had fused with his skin, the weight of it sinking deep into his flesh. "The last photo," he whispered hoarsely. "The last one, it wasn't just a photo, it was a warning." A flash of memory hit him then. The moment they had taken the picture at the park. The way they'd felt so carefree, so oblivious. That was when it had started. That was when it had seen them. That was when it had marked them. Suddenly the air shifted again, a ripple of movement that sent a shockwave of cold through the room. Maggie gasped, taking a step back as the shadows grew more pronounced, thicker, as though the very walls were melting into a single mass of blackness. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness, except for the faint glow, the eyes. They gleamed faintly in the dark, like twin stars, cold and unblinking, watching them all, now more pronounced than ever. The figure, once a faint shape in the background of their photos, was now fully visible. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. It stood in the center of the room, its gaze fixed on Lucas. The eyes were wide, unblinking and hollow, like black pits that threatened to consume him whole. And there was something wrong about its face. There were no features, no nose or mouth, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin, but the eyes, they were alive. The eyes saw him. "Lucas," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with the kind of fear that clutched at her throat, choking her. "Let go of it. Let go of the camera." But Lucas couldn't hear her. He couldn't hear anything over the pounding of his own heart. The rushing blood that was so loud in his ears, it drowned out the world around him. His vision blurred. and for a split second he thought he saw a smile, a grotesque, twisted smile, forming where the face should have been. But it wasn't a smile. It was a grimace. A mocking, predatory expression that made his stomach churn. The figure's eyes narrowed, and it moved, suddenly, impossibly fast, like the flicker of a shadow, the air itself distorting around it. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, floating just inches above the floor as it reached for him. Its cold, inhuman hand reached out, its long fingers stretching toward him, pulling at the very air, drawing him in. "Stop!" Lucas screamed, his voice raw, desperate. He fought, pulling back, but the camera wouldn't let go. It was glued to his hand, as if something invisible was holding it in place, forcing him to look into the lens. The figure was closer now, so close that Lucas could feel its presence. Cold, unnatural, suffocating. The eyes locked onto his. It was too close. "Take the picture." The voice, no, not a voice, but a command, slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like an iron chain. "Take the picture, Lucas. Let me in." He tried to turn away, tried to break free, but it was impossible. His hand, trembling and weak, lifted the camera, pointing the lens at the figure in front of him. There was no more denying it. This wasn't just a presence in a photo anymore. It was here, in the room, in the dark, in his mind. It wasn't going to stop until it had him, until it had all of them. Through the viewfinder, the figure's eyes stared back at him, and for the first time, he saw it. The truth. The eyes weren't just eyes. They were a doorway. They were what was left of whatever this thing was, whatever it had become. And now, it was inside him, pulling him toward the lens, into the darkness. "No!" Lucas screamed, his body convulsing, his mind shattering. He closed his eyes, but it was too late. The camera clicked, the shutter snapped, and then the room exploded with light. The figure was gone. Everything was silent. Everything was still. The shadows had disappeared. The air returned to its normal weight, and the oppressive pressure that had hung over them was gone. The camera fell from Lucas's hand, landing with a soft thud on the table. Its lens cracked, shattered, as though it had been struck by something too powerful to comprehend. Maggie and Sarah rushed to him, their faces pale with the horror that had unfolded before them. Danny was shaking, his eyes wide, his face lost in confusion. We're okay," Sarah whispered, looking around the room, trying to make sense of the chaos. The eyes, the figure, the overwhelming sense of something other. It was all gone, just like that. But then, in the far corner of the room, the last photo, the one Lucas had taken, was resting face up on the table. The eyes, they were still there. They were watching. There are things we see but refuse to believe, things that linger in the corners of our vision, just beyond reach of reason. The mind is a terrible thing. It plays tricks on you when you least expect it, blurring the line between what's real and what's not. If you look too closely, you might start to wonder if it's all just a figment of your imagination or something much darker. It started with a flicker, one small shift in the shadows that made Sarah question her own senses. She was alone in her apartment that night. It was the kind of night that didn't let you forget it was winter, cold pressing against the window panes like some forgotten memory trying to crawl in. The air outside was sharp, icy, like a blade drawn across your skin. Inside, though, the warmth from the radiator filled the room with a kind of dull, comforting hum. The light from her reading lamp cast a soft glow, and the rest of the room fell into shadow, just the way it always had. Sarah had never been one to be overly superstitious, nor did she believe in ghosts or anything like that. She wasn't a fan of horror stories, didn't seek out anything that might rattle her nerves. But sometimes there's a stillness that clings to the room, a kind of oppressive quiet that makes the air feel thicker, heavier, like it's pressing down on your chest. That night, it was that stillness that had set her on edge, though she couldn't quite explain why. She'd been reading a book, something mindless, a distraction, a way to escape the silence. As her eyes moved over the pages, the edges of the room seemed to blur. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something shift in the far corner, the one next to the bookshelf. But it was quick, barely noticeable. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, nothing was there. It was probably just the light, she thought, maybe a trick of the shadows. It had happened before, the way the walls of her apartment stretched and shifted at night, the way the light from the lamp seemed to pull strange shapes from the corners of the room. Shadows always played tricks like that. Nothing more. But it had been there, hadn't it? She hadn't imagined it. A small figure, tall, dark, and wrong, just standing in the corner, watching. She turned away from the window to the small coffee table by her side, where a cup of tea had long gone cold. Shaking off the uneasy feeling that had crawled up her spine, she picked up the cup, her fingers trembling slightly as she took a sip. The warmth helped for a moment. Her apartment was small, cozy, just a one-bedroom in a building that had seen better days, but it had always felt like a safe space. It was hers. She had decorated it just the way she liked, but tonight the usual comfort it provided seemed distant, like a memory she couldn't quite reach. Her eyes kept drifting back to the corner of the room, that same spot where she had thought she saw something move, but now there was nothing. It wasn't unusual for her to feel a little paranoid at times. She had always been the type to overthink things, to let the smallest detail grow into a bigger problem in her mind. But there was something about that corner, the way it seemed to always be just outside her line of sight, that set her on edge. The flicker happened again, just as she was about to set the teacup down on the table. A quick, sharp motion, like the shift of a shadow. The corner. Her heart skipped. Had it moved? The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she felt the weight of her own gaze, the way it seemed to expect something. Something was there. Something that shouldn't be. She stood up, slowly, cautiously, keeping her eyes locked on the corner as she moved across the room. Her breath caught in her throat, and her feet felt heavier than usual, like walking through water. The room was too quiet, too still. The lamp above her buzzed faintly, and for a moment the silence felt unnatural, oppressive, as if something were waiting. She reached the corner, her eyes narrowing in the dim light. There was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Her mind had to be playing tricks on her. She was just tired, too much work, too little sleep. That was all it was. But as she turned to walk away, there was that feeling again, the presence. It was so faint at first, like a ghost brushing against her skin, but it grew as she stepped back toward the center of the room. She could feel it now. It was there, hovering just beyond her reach. And then, as she reached for her cup again, she saw it, just for a moment, a figure dark and tall in the corner of her vision. It was there, standing just outside her direct line of sight. Her heart jumped into her throat. She spun around, but the corner was empty once more. The shadow wasn't gone, though. It was still there, watching her, waiting. Something dark, something wrong. It knows. A cold sweat prickled along her spine, and she had to fight to steady her breath. Her mind raced, scrambling for some explanation, but there was none. She wasn't crazy. This was happening. This wasn't her imagination. That thing, whatever it was real. A flicker, a figure. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and she hugged her arms to her chest, the room suddenly too big, too silent. Her thoughts spiraled in every direction, but they all seemed to circle back to the same truth. It was there, in the corner, but when she turned again, it was gone. She stood there, staring at the empty corner, her heartbeat slow and measured now. She had to be imagining things. It was just shadows, nothing more. She turned away, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread, but the air still felt thick. Her mind told her to leave it alone, to let it go, but she couldn't. Something was there. The days passed in a haze of restless nights and uneasy moments. The shadow, if that's what it was, never revealed itself again, at least not in any overt way. But it was there, always just out of reach, always lurking just beyond her sight. Sarah convinced herself that it was all in her head, a trick of the light, a misperception born of exhaustion. But then one night it happened again. This time it wasn't a flicker. This time the figure in the corner was standing still, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She could feel its gaze even when she wasn't looking directly at it. And this time it wasn't fading back into the darkness. It was staying. It knew her. It knew her deepest fears. In the weeks that followed, Sarah did her best to convince herself it was nothing. Her mind was playing tricks on her. There were plenty of rational explanations, weren't there? A flicker of light from the street lamps outside, casting strange shadows, or maybe the way her tired eyes refused to focus properly. It had to be that. But every time she walked past the corner of her living room, the corner where the shadow had first appeared, her heart would beat a little faster, her breath a little shorter. She had the distinct, unshakable feeling that something was waiting for her, watching, always watching. The figure, whatever it was, hadn't appeared again in a way she could see, not directly, but she could feel it. She could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, in the darkened corners of her home, in the stillness that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Her apartment, her safe, quiet sanctuary, was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a trap. At night, when the house was at its quietest, Sarah would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the building echoing through her mind like footsteps in the dark. The feeling of being watched, of being not alone, became unbearable. She'd turn toward the wall, closing her eyes tight, and tell herself it was all in her head. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't losing her mind. But that was the problem. The longer the days went by, the more certain she became that something was in the room with her. And it was waiting. Every night, as the darkness crept deeper into her apartment, she swore she could hear faint whispers, so low they might have been nothing more than the hum of the refrigerator or the wind outside. But they sounded so intentional, like they were speaking to her through the cracks in her mind. It was subtle at first, just a hint of a whisper that made her ears twitch. But the next night, it was louder, more persistent. Sarah. The first time she heard it, she thought it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But as she sat up in bed listening to the emptiness of her apartment, she realized it hadn't been a dream. She had heard it. Someone had spoken her name. Her breath caught in her throat. She strained her ears in the silence, waiting, but nothing came. She glanced at the corner where the shadows always lingered, but of course, there was nothing there. Nothing at all. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for the right moment to speak again, to do more than just whisper her name. It happened the next day, afternoon this time, when the sun was low, casting long shadows through her apartment. She had just returned from work, exhausted from the grind of her day, and had dropped her purse carelessly on the couch. The hum of the fridge filled the silence, and Sarah stood in the kitchen preparing a quick meal for herself. She was just about to put the kettle on when she froze. Her eyes flickered to the corner, the one next to the bookshelf, the one where the shadows seemed to shift more often than they should. And there it was, a shape, a figure. She could barely make it out, the light from the window too dim to reveal much. But it was unmistakable, tall, slender, and unnervingly still. It was standing there in the farthest corner of her vision, just outside the reach of the room's light, as if it knew just how much she could see. And it was waiting. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She knew what was happening. She had known since that first night. It was the figure, it was real, and it was here, again, watching. She turned away quickly, looking toward the kitchen, the counter, anything that would pull her focus away from the corner. She fought the panic that bubbled up in her chest, tried to ignore the frantic pounding of her heart in her ears. It was just her imagination, she told herself. It had to be. But she couldn't stop herself from glancing back, couldn't ignore the feeling that the figure was still there, waiting for her to acknowledge it. The room felt colder now, even though the sun was still shining through the windows. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It had become more defined. The air around it seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though it had taken form in a way Sarah wasn't prepared for. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had substance now. There was something there, something that had always been there, hiding just beyond the corner of her perception. "Stop it," she whispered aloud, though her voice trembled. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince more, herself or the figure. She took a deep breath, turned away, and focused her attention on the tea kettle that was slowly coming to a boil. But the longer she ignored it, the closer it seemed to get. That night, Sarah tried to sleep, but the whispers were louder now, more distinct. They were no longer just calling her name. "You're alone, Sarah." The words came from the corner, from the shadows, low and insistent, like a voice she had known her entire life. The sound was a raspy whisper, but it carried the weight of something older, something ancient, and it knew her. It knew her more intimately than anyone ever could. She felt her blood run cold as the voice continued, the words like ice seeping into her veins. "It's okay to be afraid." Her hands shook as she pulled the covers up to her chin, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to drown out the voice, trying to force herself back into the reality she had known just a few days ago. But the more she tried to resist, the more insistent the voice became. "I know what you're afraid of, Sarah." Her breath caught, her pulse racing. It knew. It knew. The voice was speaking her deepest fear, the one she never told anyone, the one she had buried deep inside herself. The voice knew things no one else did, things even she couldn't admit aloud. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get out, but her body was frozen. The weight of the presence in the room was suffocating her. The whispers were all around her now, like they were inside her head, crawling through her thoughts, wrapping around her consciousness, until she couldn't think straight anymore. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze darting to the corner. And there it was, the figure. It had moved. It was closer now, just barely, but it was unmistakable. The tall, shadowy form was just beyond the reach of the bed, in the space between the nightstand and the window. And its eyes, she couldn't see them, but she could feel them. Cold, unblinking, and filled with a hunger she couldn't understand. The figure was there, just beyond her line of sight, always just a step away. And it was waiting for her to acknowledge it. waiting for her to admit that it was real. The days began to blur together after that night, each one more suffocating than the last. Sarah began avoiding her own home, staying late at work, just to delay the inevitable return to that corner. She tried to reach out to friends to call anyone who might help, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them. Who could she tell? How could she explain that something was watching her from the corners of her room, something that seemed to know her every fear, every secret? Her only solace came in the form of the small moments when she could be anywhere but here, when she could step outside into the cold air and pretend for just a few moments that everything was okay, that she wasn't being watched. But every time she returned home, the figure was there, waiting. It's funny how quickly a person can become accustomed to fear. At first, it was the whispers in the corner of the room, soft, distant, like the murmur of a stranger just beyond hearing. But now, as the days bled into each other, the fear was no longer something she could push aside. It had become a part of her life, settling deep within her bones, creeping under her skin. The presence in the corner, the watcher, had grown stronger, bolder, and with it, so too had her sense of dread. Each night, the darkness seemed to pull at her from the edges of the room. The figure that had once been just a fleeting shadow, a trick of the light, was now unmistakably real. It wasn't hidden in the shadows anymore. It moved, slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring each step closer to her. And its eyes, she could feel them even when she couldn't see them. The weight of them pressed against her, a constant reminder that she was never truly alone. Every time she lay in bed, her thoughts racing, it was there, watching. She had started sleeping with the light on, at first, just the bedside lamp. But that wasn't enough. The light seemed to push back against the darkness for a moment, but the shadows would always creep in. The figure, it, was always there, no matter how many lights she flicked on. Always lurking in the corner, waiting, listening, knowing. The whispers had changed too. They no longer just called her name or whispered her deepest fears. Now they were speaking things that hadn't been spoken aloud in years, secrets that she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten about them. The things that only the darkness could know. And it knew. It knew everything. "You'll never escape it," the voice murmured one night, its words so soft they almost melted into the air. "You've always been afraid of the dark. You've always been afraid of being alone." Her heart pounded as the voice rang in her ears, the words twisting around her chest like cold fingers. She tried to push it away, but the fear that clung to her was like a vice, tightening with every word. But it wasn't just the voice. It was the movement, the shifting. Every time she turned her head, every time she closed her eyes, she could feel it moving closer. She could feel its presence, closer and closer, until it felt like it was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. She began to see things out of the corner of her eye, small, fleeting glimpses of it, darting just beyond the periphery of her vision. Every time she tried to focus, it was gone. But the next time she looked away, there it was again, a shadow, a shape, inching forward, step by agonizing step. It was never still. It was never gone. It was always watching. And she knew it wasn't just a figment of her imagination anymore. It had been real from the beginning, a presence so heavy that it was impossible to deny. But what was it? Where had it come from? Why was it following her? The question haunted her, gnawed at her insides, until it became all she could think about. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Every day felt like a slow crawl toward the inevitable confrontation, and yet she still couldn't bring herself to face it. not fully. Every time she tried, every time she thought she might be brave enough to confront the figure in the corner, the whispers would return, louder now, insistent. "You don't want to know the truth," the voice would say, always just behind her, so close, yet never enough to reach. "It's not the dark you're afraid of me. You're afraid of what I can do." It was taunting her. It knew, but every night the figure remained just out of reach. Standing, watching, waiting, she tried everything she could think of to rid herself of it. She bought sage, burned candles, even called a therapist to talk about her growing fear. But nothing worked. The watcher didn't leave. In fact, grew stronger with each passing day. Every time she stepped into the room, it was there, waiting in the corner, a dark silhouette, barely visible in the low light. It was a shadow without form, with no face, no eyes, just a presence. And the longer it stayed, the more it changed. One night, after a particularly long and exhausting day, she walked into the room, barely able to keep her eyes open. She moved without thinking, autopilot taking over, reaching for the light switch. But as her hand hovered over the switch, something made her stop. Something shifted in the air, a pulse, a hum that she could feel deep in her chest. The room had grown still, too still. Her heart skipped a beat. The weight of the silence was like a living thing, pressing down on her. She turned slowly, her eyes flicking toward the corner. The figure was moving. It hadn't been there, not in the way she had seen it before, but now it was standing, no longer a shadow, no longer just something in the corner. No, it had grown more distinct. The figure was now a shape, a form that was unmistakably human, though twisted, distorted in ways that made her blood run cold. The figure had eyes, or at least it had something that resembled eyes. Two hollow black pits that stared at her from the darkness, the emptiness inside them like the vastness of space. They were so black, so empty, that for a split second she thought they might swallow her whole. Her breath caught in her throat, her limbs frozen, locked in place by fear as the figure stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. The room seemed to shrink with each inch it moved closer, and the air grew colder with each breath she took. "Can't escape," the voice whispered, now clear, now distinct. It was no longer a murmur, it was a hiss that seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating in the walls, in the corners of the room, in her very mind. "I know your fear, I've always known it, and now I'm going to take it." She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, stuck in place, her eyes locked on the figure that continued to approach, each step bringing it closer, closer, until she could feel its presence right behind her. The whispers were louder now, too loud, filling her mind, her soul. "I see you, I hear you, I know you." It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in her bones, her blood, as though it had always been inside her, waiting. Her feet felt like lead, unable to move, but as she tried to scream, as she tried to force herself to move, she realized with a sickening sense of horror that her voice was gone. It was as though the darkness had swallowed it whole. And then, just as the figure reached the edge of the bed, just as she thought she might finally lose herself completely to it, the lights flickered. The lights flickered. Just like that, the shadow paused. The whispers, those terrible whispers that had burrowed into the corners of her mind, stilled. The figure remained still for a moment, as if sensing something had shifted in the air, as if waiting for the world to come crashing back together. But it was different now. It was darker. The room had grown colder, and the coldness seeped into her skin, her bones, until it felt like ice running through her veins. The flickering lights didn't help. If anything, they made the shadows more aggressive, more restless, like they wanted to tear the room apart. In that flicker, she caught the unmistakable shape of it. The figure, standing in the corner of her room, no longer just a shadow, but something that filled the space. Something that had always been there. But the worst part, the part that made her heart falter and her breath catch, was the eyes. Those dark pits that had once been empty, that had once been nothing more than voids of shadow. Now they were open. They stared at her with such intensity that she could feel them burn through her soul. The cold darkness of them, the void, the nothing, pressed into her mind like hands over her eyes, forcing her to see only the horror behind them. The silence in the room was deafening, and for a moment she thought she might scream. But she couldn't. She couldn't find her voice. For the first time since it all began, she truly understood what it meant to be utterly helpless. The figure didn't move, not yet. It simply stood there in that same corner, watching, waiting, its eyes pulling at her like gravity, demanding her attention. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in as though the space between her and it was shrinking by the second. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her feet were frozen, rooted to the ground, her entire body locked in a state of terror that made her feel like a helpless prey animal caught in the gaze of its hunter. And it knew, the figure knew her fear. It was her fear. "You've always known, haven't you?" The voice hissed from the darkness, louder now, more insistent. "You've always known you were never alone in this room, in your life. I've been here all along, just waiting." Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to tear her eyes away, but something within her, something primal, kept her staring. The air was thick, like the room was breathing along with her, and with every breath she took, it grew colder, heavier. The figure didn't move. It stayed in its corner, but its presence was everywhere, pressing in on her from all sides. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like it was conspiring with it, part of it. She was trapped. "Please," her voice cracked as she whispered, barely audible, "please, leave me alone." But the figure only shifted in the corner. The shadows around it seemed to deepen, as if its very presence was pulling all the light out of the room. The eyes grew wider, darker, pulling her in deeper. It wanted her to look. It needed her to acknowledge it, to understand that it had always been there. The coldness in the room grew unbearable, and she could feel herself starting to shake, her teeth chattering as the shadows seemed to crawl into her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look, refusing to give it what it wanted. But the whispers, they wouldn't stop. It's too late. The voice seemed to come from all around her now. She could feel the words reverberating in the very walls. "You've already seen it. You've already felt it. It's a part of you now. I've always been a part of you." Her breath was shallow, ragged now as she slowly opened her eyes again, a bead of cold sweat running down her face. And there in the corner, it was still there, closer now. The figure had moved, but not with the kind of smoothness she expected. It was like the very air around it was vibrating with the tension of something wrong, something that should not exist. And then she saw it. The thing she had been avoiding, the thing she hadn't dared to look at before. The eyes. They were wide open now, fully visible, and they weren't just black pits anymore. No, there was something worse in them now, something that made her stomach twist in disgust. There were no pupils, no whites, just endless deep pools of blackness swirling with a motion that made her dizzy. They were alive in a way no eyes should be, alive in a way that spoke of ancient, terrible things. They were hungry. and they were staring right at her. You've always been afraid of the dark, haven't you? Of what lies beneath the surface, of what's always been right in front of you. But you can't hide from me now. I am the dark. I am what you fear most. The words were a whisper, a hiss that burrowed deep into her mind, weaving through her thoughts, tearing apart the last remnants of rational thought. She could feel them in her head, could feel the weight of them pressing on her skull, like fingers digging into her temples. The world was spinning now, the darkness closing in. The shadows were swallowing everything, her breath, the air, the light, and she felt herself beginning to sink into it. There was no escape. The figure didn't need to move to make her feel trapped. It had already surrounded her. It was inside her, in the way it made her feel, in the way it knew her every secret, her every fear. "Don't you see?" The voice came again, louder now, almost a growl. "You can't escape it. You can't escape me. I will always be here, always watching, always waiting." It wasn't just in the corner anymore. It was everywhere. The air was thick with it. The room no longer felt like her own. It felt like it was shrinking, folding in on itself. She could almost feel its eyes on her from every direction, every corner. She was trapped. No escape. It was in the way the shadows twisted, the way the walls seemed to breathe in and out with the rhythm of her fear. She could feel the darkness pulling her down, drowning her in its depths. And then, just as quickly as it all started, there was a sudden crack, the sharp sound of something breaking. The light flickered once more, the air shifted, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, everything was still. Then it was gone. The figure was gone, but she could still feel it. The weight of its eyes pressing into her mind, following her wherever she went. It was gone. The figure that had haunted her every waking moment, that had twisted her mind and drawn out her deepest fears, had vanished. But Sarah knew deep down that it wasn't really gone. The absence of it didn't bring relief. It only brought the terrible, suffocating knowledge that it was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of her consciousness, waiting. The room seemed to breathe again, the shadows pulling back, releasing their hold on her. The cold that had gripped her skin, that had worked its way deep into her bones, began to recede. But the silence was worse than anything. The silence wasn't comforting. It was ominous, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next moment of terror to unfold. Her body was still trembling, her mind racing. Had she imagined it all? Was the figure truly gone, or was it simply playing a different game now, watching her, waiting for the next crack in her defenses? She couldn't tell anymore. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to summon the strength to stand, to move. But something was wrong. She could still feel it. The weight of the figure's presence, the coldness in the room, that gnawing, creeping sensation that something was just out of reach, waiting to reach out and grab her. She opened her eyes again, heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty. There was no shadow, no movement, no figure standing in the corner, but she couldn't shake the feeling, no, the certainty that it was there. The watcher hadn't left. "I'm still here." The whisper came again, but it was different this time. It wasn't just in her mind, it was in the room with her, a voice that echoed from the walls themselves, as though it had taken root in the very fabric of her apartment. Her blood turned to ice. The darkness pressed in from every direction, suffocating her, squeezing her chest, pushing the air from her lungs. "You thought you could escape me? You thought I would just go away?" The voice hissed, now louder, more furious. "I've always been here. I am the dark. I am the fear that crawls under your skin. You cannot escape what you have become." Her breath was ragged as the words swirled around her, each one sinking deeper into her mind. It wasn't the voice of something outside her. It was a voice that knew her, that had always known her. It had been with her from the start, feeding on her anxiety, her terror. It had grown stronger with every moment she spent in its presence. And now it was here, inside her head. She tried to scream, to fight it off, but it was as though the walls themselves were closing in, their very surfaces alive with the weight of its presence. The air grew thick like molasses, and her movements felt sluggish, heavy. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stand, to fight back. "No more. I'm not afraid of you." The words tasted bitter on her tongue. She didn't believe them. Not really. She was afraid. She was terrified. But she couldn't give in to it. She couldn't let it win. Not again. With a shaky breath, she stood up, forcing her legs to obey. Her heart was pounding in her chest, so loud she could hear it in her ears. The silence was suffocating, and she realized, too late, that it wasn't truly silence. It was the absence of the figure's voice, the absence of its whispering, waiting. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, and she knew that at any moment it would exhale, and she would be consumed. She had to act. "No more games," she whispered. Her hand shook as she reached for the door, her mind racing for any way to escape. She couldn't run forever. She knew that. But if she didn't leave now, if she didn't do something, it would take her. It would take everything from her, the very light inside her. The door opened slowly, the creak of the hinges making her flinch. She stepped into the hallway, the world outside her apartment feeling too quiet, like the calm before the storm. Every shadow, every flicker of light felt like the watcher was there, lurking in the dark, watching her every move. "You can't run from me." The voice was inside her head now, inside her body, pulling at her, dragging her back toward the apartment. She could feel the tug of its presence, feel it in the way her limbs were moving, unwillingly, like strings pulled by an invisible hand. "You belong to me now." The words were too close, too intimate, and for a moment Sarah thought she might collapse under the weight of them. She was losing herself. She was losing the fight, but then something shifted. A light, a flicker of something inside her, a spark of defiance. She wasn't done yet. Not yet. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the panic that rose in her chest. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing: she wasn't giving in. And so, with every ounce of strength she could summon, she turned back toward her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her. Her breathing was ragged now, but there was something else, something rising inside her, something she hadn't felt in days. Control. She had to take it back. She had to face it once and for all. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. The room was still dark, but she could feel it now, the watcher, the presence that had been haunting her, waiting for her to break. It was still there, its cold, empty eyes fixed on her, but it was different. It wasn't as strong as it had been before. The suffocating weight of it, the darkness pressing in, seemed to waver just for a moment. With a deep breath, she moved toward the corner, her body trembling, but her resolve strengthening with each step. The shadows felt colder now, but the air felt lighter. The closer she got to the corner, the more she could feel the figure recoil, pulling away from her, as if it were afraid. And then she saw it. The eyes, those endless black eyes, flickered for just a moment. She felt it then, the truth. The watcher was afraid. The darkness it had lived in for so long, the fear it had fed on, was fading. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. but it was enough. "You're just a shadow, just a figment of my fear." The figure didn't move, but she could feel it shrinking, fading. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but its hold on her was weakening. Slowly, painfully, it shrank into the corner, into the darkness, until it was a whisper of something that might have been. And then, nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight lifted, the cold receded, and the room was just a room again, her room, her space, empty. But even as the terror ebbed away, the truth lingered like a bitter aftertaste in her mouth. The watcher hadn't left. It was still there. Somewhere in the deepest corners of her mind. Watching. Waiting. Forever. The house sat far from the world, swallowed by thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The dirt road leading to it was little more than a forgotten trail, overgrown with brambles and wild vines. For anyone who didn't know it existed, the house might as well have been a ghost, a silhouette, lost in time, fading into obscurity. And yet there they were, pulling up the uneven gravel driveway in an old, weathered car that had long since seen better days. The tires crunched over the stones, a harsh sound that seemed to slice through the heavy quiet of the surrounding forest. The large, dilapidated house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, staring out at them like the hollow eyes of a corpse. It was impossible to ignore the strange feeling that prickled at the back of the mind. As the car rolled to a stop in front of the wide, broken-down porch, the house seemed to breathe with them. It exhaled an ancient sigh, a slow and heavy breath that could almost be heard if you listened long enough. No one in the car spoke at first. There was a strange heaviness to the air, as though the house itself was waiting for them to make the first move. The door to the house creaked open as they unloaded their bags and boxes. Each step taken on the porch sounded too loud, too hollow, like the wood was trying to remember how to hold weight. The air smelled stale, tinged with the scent of mildew, and something else, something faint, almost sweet, like decay. Inside, the house was just as they had imagined it, expansive, with high ceilings and walls that stretched up to the shadows. It felt empty, in a way that went beyond the lack of furniture. There was no warmth here, no sign of light. The rooms were wide and echoing, the kind of place where every footstep seemed to reverberate, filling the air with the hollow sound of emptiness. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. The once vibrant floral patterns faded and chipped. Cobwebs hung in the corners, thick and grey, as if even the spiders had abandoned the place. But despite the neglect, there was something inviting about it, a strange allure that pulled at them, like the house was calling them in. It was perfect, or at least it seemed perfect. They had moved here to escape the city, to start fresh. The quiet, the space, the isolation, it was everything they had dreamed of. They set to work, unpacking their things, filling the silence with the bustle of settling in. But even as they worked, that feeling never left. The one that tugged at the edges of their awareness, the one that made them glance over their shoulders as if someone was watching from the shadows. Every time they spoke, the words seemed to hang in the air for just a little too long, an unnatural pause that didn't belong. The first night passed without incident. They ate dinner in the spacious kitchen, the light from the flickering candles casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. They laughed, talked about old times, made plans for the future, but even as they did, something was off. The house was too quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every sound they made seemed to echo back at them, not like a normal echo, but distorted, thick and hollow, as if the walls themselves were absorbing their voices. The next day, they noticed it. At first, it was subtle. A low, distant thrum that pulsed through the house whenever anyone spoke. The sound of a voice would carry into the space and reverberate back at them, but it was wrong. Instead of bouncing off the walls with the usual crispness, the words seemed to linger in the air. It was almost as if the house was listening, waiting. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, as they unpacked the final boxes in the living room. There was a pause, the air thick with anticipation, before the voice seemed to return in a twisted echo. "Hear that?" No one answered. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, but they said nothing. The hollow voice of the house had already begun to get under their skin. The days passed, and with each one, the feeling grew. The house seemed to feed on their presence. The more they spoke, the more they noticed the walls becoming alive. The echoes grew stronger, more intense, like something was feeding off their voices. The hollow sound of their words would bounce off the walls, swirl through the rooms, and return to them in distorted shapes, like whispers, like calls from the deep, thickening the air. The more they tried to ignore it, the more it grew. It wasn't until the third day that it became undeniable. It was evening again, and the family had gathered in the living room, sitting in mismatched chairs, tired from the day's work. The wind howled outside, but inside the house seemed to pulse with an eerie stillness. Even the shadows felt thick and oppressive, as though they were pressing in from every corner. Someone made a joke, a light-hearted comment, trying to break the strange tension that hung in the air. But as soon as the words left their lips, the walls shuddered. The sound wasn't just an echo, it was a groan, deep and reverberating, like the house itself had felt the intrusion of the words. "Did you hear that?" someone asked, eyes wide, voice cracking. They all looked at each other. The laughter that followed felt forced, nervous. They tried to shrug it off, but the air was too thick with something wrong to ignore. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, like tendrils reaching for them, and even the wind outside had quieted. All that remained was the hum, the strange thrum in the walls. It seemed to grow louder now, more persistent. "We should explore the rest of the house," one of them suggested, eager to distract themselves, to push the strange feeling out of their minds. They didn't want to acknowledge the growing unease between them, but they didn't need to. Every time they spoke, the house seemed to wake up. Upstairs, the sound was different, stranger still. The walls felt closer here, tighter, as though the house itself had drawn them in, enclosing them in a space that didn't belong to them. Each room they passed was dark, full of dust and cobwebs, untouched for years, perhaps decades. It felt like no one had ever lived here before. The emptiness was palpable, and then they came across it. A door at the end of the hallway. It was old, the wood worn with age, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air around it was still, unnaturally still. The door was closed, but it didn't feel like it had ever been opened. One of them reached for the handle, a trembling hand gripping the cold metal. The others watched in silence. The moment the door opened, they all froze. There was nothing there. Nothing but dark emptiness. And yet, the echo, the hollow sound began. It came from the walls again, a distorted, vibrating hum that seemed to twist around them like a living thing, drawing them into the darkness. The deeper they stood in the room, the more oppressive the air became, as though the house were pulling them in, hungry, waiting for them to speak again. "Let's leave," someone whispered, their voice shaking, but the house wouldn't let them. And just before the door slammed shut behind them, they heard it. A voice, software low, whispers that seemed to breathe through the walls. No one knew if it was real. No one knew if it was the house or something else. But they knew one thing: the house wasn't just old, it was alive. The following days felt like an unraveling. There was no single event that marked the moment things truly shifted. It wasn't one loud crash or one whispered voice in the dead of night that sealed their fate. No, it was these small things, the creaking of the house as it settled, the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little further each day, like fingers reaching toward them. Even in the daytime, when the sun shone weakly through the thick clouds above, the house felt dark. It didn't matter how many lamps were switched on or how many windows they opened to let in the light. The oppressive feeling remained. It was as if the house didn't just grow older, it was living, and it wanted something from them. It started with the noises, the hollow sounds in the walls, the strange hum that seemed to follow them from room to room grew louder. They couldn't ignore it anymore. At first, they convinced themselves it was the house's age, the old wood settling, the pipes shifting as they adjusted to the change in temperature, the wind howling through cracks and gaps in the structure. But there was something wrong about the way it moved, the way it seemed to wait for them to speak. The family had tried everything to shut it out, playing music, keeping the television on, even talking over the hum, as though filling the space with noise would make it disappear. But it only seemed to make it worse. The more they spoke, the more the house seemed to respond. The air thickened with each word, each sentence that passed between them. And no matter what they did, they could never quite escape the feeling that something was listening. That was when the door in the upstairs hallway began to creak open. It wasn't a sound they had heard before, not like the natural groaning of the house, the settling of old beams or the creaking of floorboards beneath their feet. No, this sound was different. It was as though the door was being opened from the inside by something other. And when they went to investigate, the door would always be ajar, just wide enough for them to feel its presence, but never wide enough to reveal what lay beyond. The darkness behind the door felt wrong. They could feel it in their bones. It was one afternoon when they could stand it no longer. The house felt alive with too many whispers, too many hungry eyes watching from the dark corners. The youngest member of the family, still too innocent to understand the growing sense of dread, had wandered into the hallway, drawn to that door as if it had a pull on her, a gravitational force that she couldn't resist. Her footsteps echoed on the bare wood of the floor, and as she passed, the whispering grew louder, a low murmur that seemed to seep from the cracks in the walls, the shadows. At first, she thought it was her imagination, just the house settling. But then the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were words. "Come closer." It was faint, just a breath against her ear. But it was enough to make her freeze, to make the blood in her veins run cold. She stood there for a moment, listening, her heart racing. The shadows around her seemed to shift, to move with a life of their own, as if the house was breathing, pulsing with a hunger that grew stronger the longer she stood there. "Come closer," it whispered again, this time louder, closer still. Terrified, she turned on her heel and ran back toward the living room, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as she reached the safety of the others, the whispering didn't stop. It followed her, echoing through the hallways, bouncing off the walls and vibrating deep in her bones. She couldn't speak at first. She couldn't bring herself to say anything. But when she finally found her voice, It was shaking. I heard it, calling me. They tried to comfort her, to reassure her that it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. It was nothing, they insisted. But deep down, they all knew something had changed. Something had heard her. The house itself had spoken. Later that night, the noises returned with a vengeance. The hum in the walls was louder than it had ever been before, and it carried with it a low, resonating groan, as if the house itself were alive. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and for a moment they felt as though the walls were pressing in on them, tightening around them like a vice. They were trapped, and they knew it. But still they couldn't stop themselves from speaking. The house wanted them to speak. Every conversation they had, no matter how mundane, only fed the thing growing inside the walls. The more they spoke, the more the house hungered. And they felt it. The way their voices seemed to disappear into the walls, as though they were being absorbed, consumed. There was something terrifyingly wrong about it. The hum was constant now, a presence that gnawed at the edges of their minds. Even when they tried to ignore it, it was always there, whispering, drawing them in. But it was the nights that were the worst. Every time they tried to sleep, it was like the house became alive with sound. The creaking of the floorboards sounded like footsteps, following them as they moved from room to room. The walls would groan, the echo of their voices ringing in their ears, even in their sleep. And each night, the shadows seemed to draw closer, inching toward them, as if the house itself were waiting for them to speak again. One night, as they sat huddled together in the living room, trying to ignore the ever-growing sense of dread that filled the air, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, they thought it was over, that the house had finally gone still. But that's when they heard it, a voice, soft, hollow, and impossibly deep. It echoed through the walls, through the floor, through the very air they breathed. It was the sound of the house itself speaking, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. "More," the voice whispered. "More of your voices." They froze. No one moved, no one breathed. The voice was an invitation and a warning, a dark promise. And then the sound of footsteps began, not the creaking of the house this time, but the sound of real footsteps moving slowly across the floor above them. They weren't alone anymore. The house had come alive. And it wanted more than just their voices. It wanted their souls. The footsteps above them grew louder. At first, they thought it was one of them moving across the floor upstairs. But as the sound intensified, they realized something was horribly wrong. The steps were slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of them. The house had settled, yes, but this was no simple creak of old wood. This was something far worse, a presence, one that moved through the house like a living thing. They stood frozen in the living room, their eyes darting toward the ceiling, as if they could somehow stop what was happening. The air was thick with the sound of footsteps, dragging and echoing, slow as though each movement were being measured. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was unbearable, suffocating in its intensity. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered, voice trembling, but no one answered. It wasn't a question. They all heard it. They all felt it. The house was no longer merely a home. It was alive, moving, breathing, feeding. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift again, as if something were moving within them, drawing closer, inching forward. They had been foolish to think it was just an old house. They had been foolish to think it would be just another abandoned place to fix up, another retreat in the countryside. The truth settled over them like a cold weight. They were not alone. And this house was not empty. Each of them had felt the subtle change in the atmosphere. At first, it had been the echoes, a strange hum filling the air, a sense that the house itself was listening, waiting for them to speak. But now, the very air around them seemed to pulse with something darker. The walls thrummed with an unnatural energy, and the shadows crept further into the room, stretching like fingers, as if they were hungry to touch them, to pull them into the dark. The voice that had whispered in the walls, had not stopped. It was always there, just beneath the surface of their thoughts. And now, they could feel it more clearly than ever before. It wasn't just a hum, it was a calling, a need that reverberated through their very bones. "We can't stay here." The words broke from one of them in a rush, and it was as if the house heard it. The walls groaned in response, as if the house was alive and reacting to the words. "No, we have to," another answered, voice shaking but desperate. "We need to finish what we came here for. It's just an old house. Nothing to be afraid of." But even as they said it, they knew the truth. The house was far from empty. It was full of something they couldn't comprehend, something older than time, something that had been waiting for them. And it was getting stronger. The house was awake. It had fed on their voices for too long, absorbed their words, and now it was growing more powerful. The shadows had deepened, stretched further across the walls, and the air felt thick with something crawling, something reaching. There was no safe corner, no escape from the oppressive silence that had taken root in their minds. The youngest among them, who had first heard the whispers, was the first to speak again, her voice barely more than a breath. "I saw it," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw it last night, in the hallway, the shadow." No one said anything. They didn't need to. They had all seen it, or felt it. Something had been watching them, something had been waiting. They could feel its eyes on them in every dark corner, behind every door. And it was getting closer. "What are we going to do?" one of them asked, fear creeping into their voice. "It's too late now, isn't it? We can't just leave. The house won't let us." The others fell silent. They knew it was true. The house had a pull on them, a gravity that held them in place like moths to a flame. They could feel the hunger, the insatiable need to consume them, to take everything they had. The voice had whispered again, more. The walls had grown tighter, the shadows deeper, and still, the house had not stopped speaking. It had not stopped listening. They had fed it with their words, and now it was time to pay the price. They couldn't leave. The realization hit them like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the house, it was the house that had claimed them. It was the house that had fed on their fear, on their conversation, on their lives. They were already bound to it, and they didn't know how to escape. A deep, unsettling groan rumbled through the walls again, low and slow, like a growl from some ancient creature waking from its slumber. The house wanted something. It wasn't content to simply listen anymore. It had grown hungry. The echo of their voices, the way it twisted and contorted in the air, had awakened something far older than they realized. The youngest spoke again, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "I think it wants us to speak more. It wants us to feed it more." Her words hung in the air, a heavy truth that none of them wanted to admit. They had already given too much. Every conversation, every word spoken in the house had made it stronger. The more they spoke, the more they fed the thing that lurked within the walls. And the more they spoke, the closer it came. It had been subtle at first. The way the house seemed to grow darker with each passing day, how their voices began to echo unnaturally in the rooms. But now it was impossible to deny the house was alive and it had been waiting for them. "I think we have to leave," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. But even as the words left their mouth, they could all feel it. The house didn't want them to leave. The air thickened as if to say, "No, you can't leave." The shadows grew longer, stretching further across the floor, creeping up the walls, pulling the light out of the room. And then, as though on cue, the house itself seemed to groan in hunger, its wooden beams twisting and straining. In that moment, it was as though the house had made its final demand. It wanted them, every one of them, their words, their souls. The air was suffocating now, thick with the pressure of the house's presence. The walls felt alive, as if they were breathing, exhaling in slow, heavy gasps. It was no longer just an echo that filled the rooms. It was a pressure. A voice, a deep, guttural whisper filled the room once more. This time, it wasn't a word, it was a command. More. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist, slithering toward them as if drawn by the mere sound of the voice. The walls seemed to contract, pushing them closer together, pushing them toward the center of the room. The house had awoken, and it was ready to feed. The walls groaned under the weight of silence. It wasn't the same kind of silence they had known before, the gentle hush of a room left untouched, or the peaceful stillness of a house that had settled into the quiet of the night. No, this silence was heavy. It pressed in on them, suffocating, urging them to speak. The shadows in the room stretched and pulsed with a life of their own, inching closer as the air grew colder. They could feel it now, the thickening of the space around them, like the house itself was swelling with hunger, its walls vibrating with anticipation. And all the while, the echo of their voices reverberated in their minds, a constant, insistent presence. "More," the voice whispered again, a soft hiss that slipped between the cracks of their thoughts. The house wasn't just speaking, it was commanding, pulling them in, drawing them closer. No one dared to break the silence. They all knew what would happen if they spoke again. The house was listening, waiting for them to feed it once more. The price for their words was becoming clear. The price for their silence, however, was worse. For every moment they remained silent, they could feel it growing stronger, stronger and more insistent. The walls shuddered as though straining under the pressure of their unspoken thoughts, a tension that stretched so thin it seemed about to snap. "Can't stand it," one of them whispered, voice trembling, the words escaping despite their best efforts to hold them in. The moment they did, the room shifted. It was as though the house itself exhaled, a slow, deep breath that seemed to shake the very foundations beneath them. The shadow in the corner of the room moved. For a moment, no one could breathe. No one could move. They could only stare, wide-eyed, at the corner where the darkness had deepened, drawn tighter, like a wound growing too large to heal. The figure, if it could even be called a figure, was shifting, twisting in ways that no human body should. It had no shape, no defined form. It was simply a mass of shadows, a swirling mass that seemed to pull the very light from the room. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in feelings, an emotion, a raw, guttural force that reverberated through the air, deep in their bones. It was the sensation of being watched, not by any mortal eyes, but by something ancient, something primal, a force that had existed long before they had ever set foot in this cursed place. The house had fed, and now it had grown stronger. Now it was no longer just an unseen presence in the walls. It was there, in the corner, in the shadows, in the space where they had once felt safe. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The figure continued to stretch and writhe, its shape growing more and more distinct with every passing second. It was drawing near. "They're getting closer," one of them muttered under their breath, unable to stop the words from slipping free. But those words were not enough. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't undo what they had already done. Each sentence, each whisper, each syllable they spoke had only fueled the hunger within the house. But the silence was unbearable. The urge to speak was stronger than the fear, stronger than the knowledge of the consequences. It gnawed at them like a constant ache in their chests. They were suffocating in the quiet, in the weight of it all. And with every breath they took, the house seemed to grow, to shift, drawing them further into its grasp. The shadows began to reach for them. It was subtle at first. A flicker of movement out of the corner of their eyes. A shape that seemed to stretch just beyond their line of sight, a dark blur that vanished when they turned their heads. But the feeling remained. It was getting closer, and they all knew, that whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. But there was something worse than the darkness, something worse than the oppressive weight of the house itself. It was the silence, the absence of their own voices. And it wasn't just physical silence. They felt it in their minds, the stillness creeping into their thoughts, threatening to consume them. One of them, unable to stand it any longer, broke the silence. I can't take it. We need to leave. We need to get out." But it was too late. The house knew. It had been waiting for the smallest crack, the slightest disturbance, the weakest breath. As soon as the words were spoken, the shadows shifted, and the house responded. A loud, hollow clang rang out through the house. The sound wasn't natural. No door, no window, no beam in the house should have made such a noise. But it rang out, loud and sharp, as if someone had struck the very core of the house. The voice, now more powerful, more pronounced, spoke once more, but this time there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You're still speaking." The words echoed in the room, reverberating in their bones. "But you should know, silence is the only escape. The longer you speak, the more you give me, and I will take it." The words hung in the air, and for the briefest of moments there was nothing, no sound, no movement. The figure in the corner was still, its presence palpable in the room, but it wasn't moving. Not yet. It was waiting. The house was waiting. "I don't think we can stop it," one of them said, and the fear in their voice was unmistakable. It was as though they had resigned themselves to a fate they couldn't escape. The house had already claimed them. They had given it too much. And now it was only a matter of time. "What do we do?" another whispered. The fear was contagious. There was no answer, no solution. They had no weapons, no defenses. The house had already won. It was then that they realized the full horror of their situation. It wasn't just the house that was alive. It was feeding off them, off their voices, off their fear. Every word they spoke made it stronger, gave it more power, and every moment of silence only drew them deeper into its grip. The hunger had begun, and there was no escaping it. They had sealed their fate the moment they entered. Now the house would claim them, piece by piece. One of them, gripped by the terror, started to speak again, but they could hardly finish the sentence. The words caught in their throat as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe. But before they could speak again, the house moved. The shadows gathered, swirling faster now, pulling tighter and tighter. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the house itself was stretching, shifting, moulding itself to something monstrous. The air grew colder, the silence more deafening, and in that silence they knew. It was time. The house was ready to take them. The figure, now a thing of nightmares, lunged forward, moving in ways that defied logic, stretching and contorting with grotesque speed. And as it did, it spoke, not in words, but in the cold, empty sound of every voice they had ever spoken. Every word, every conversation, they had fed it. Now it was going to take them, all of them. The house was no longer merely a building, it had become a thing, a living, breathing entity, hungry for something more. The shadows that stretched across the room, that had once only crept and pulsed in the corners, were now a mass of swirling darkness, a formless thing, gathering strength. Every inch of the house seemed to hum with a terrible life of its own, a feverish need that could not be satiated. It wanted them, all of them. It was too late to escape. It had always been too late. The moment the first word had escaped their lips, the house had started to feed. Every voice, every laugh, every conversation had been a banquet for the entity that lived inside it. And now, as they stood in the center of the living room, the thick, oppressive silence smothering them, they understood the full depth of their mistake. "We should have never come here," one of them whispered, barely able to keep their voice steady, but they were trembling. They were too scared to speak louder, too scared to say anything at all. The house had become their prison, its walls closing in on them, its floors creaking beneath their feet. The air, once fresh and crisp, now felt thick and suffocating, like the very atmosphere was weighted down by the dark presence that had awakened. The figure in the corner of the room had grown. It had stretched, twisting out of the shadows like an enormous nightmarish spider with long, gnarled legs that seemed to move independently of each other. It was monstrous, yet impossible to fully comprehend, an amalgamation of darkness and hunger, a creature without form, a thing that was drawn from their deepest fears. "No more talking," one of them pleaded, but the words barely made it past their lips before the house responded. The walls creaked louder now, as if the very foundation of the house was being shaken, a violent, reverberating noise that rattled the bones of everyone in the room. The sound of those creaking walls echoed in their minds, so deafening that it felt like their skulls might crack under the pressure. It was the house, demanding, feeding. The shadow moved again, this time faster, more determined. It shifted, growing larger, as if something was pulling it from all directions. The air felt colder, freezing cold in fact, and a sharp gust of wind swept through the room, as though the house itself had exhaled, forcing the air to crackle with the electric tension of a storm. More. They heard it in their minds, a growling, rasping voice that seeped from the walls themselves. It wasn't a voice, it was a feeling, a sensation that crawled under their skin and wrapped itself around their insides like barbed wire. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The price of their words was higher than they could have imagined. They had given it too much, fed it too long, and now it was going to take everything. The youngest one in the group, who had been the first to feel the whispers, was the first to break. She could no longer stand the oppressive weight of the silence. She could feel it. They all could feel it. The house wanted their voices. It wanted their souls. I can't. She stumbled, gasping for air, her eyes wide with fear. Her voice was a broken sob as she spoke, her words reverberating in the room like a sickening drumbeat. The shadows around her swirled, closing in tighter, the darkness wrapping around her like cold, grasping hands. And then it was as though the house inhaled. All at once, the temperature dropped, an icy gust, colder than the deepest night, swept through the room, freezing their breath in the air. The walls cracked open, as if the house itself was being torn apart from the inside. The shadows whipped around them, slashing at their faces, pulling at their limbs. The house was angry. You should have never spoken." The voice rasped, a deep, hollow sound that reverberated through the house, through their skulls. They could feel it, could feel the weight of every word they had ever spoken being dragged into the darkness, swallowed by the walls. The house was consuming them, piece by piece. "We need to leave, we—" Another of them tried to shout, but the words died in their throat. The air around them thickened, constricting their chests as though invisible hands were tightening their grip. It was as if the house was squeezing the very life out of them. But it didn't want them to leave. The house was hungry, yes, but it wasn't just after their words. It was after their souls. The house had fed for too long, and now it was full, so full it was ready to consume them whole. The darkness, the thing that lived inside the house, moved faster now, wrapping around the group, and they couldn't escape, they couldn't move. The shadow in the corner had fully taken form, stretching from the walls, a long, monstrous shape that had no face but was still looking at them, waiting. The figure was so close now that they could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze on them, pressing down on their very souls. "It's too late now," one of them whispered, their voice trembling. "We're too far gone." The shadow lunged. It wasn't a motion. They didn't see it coming. It simply was there, in the blink of an eye. The darkness enveloped them, swallowing them whole, as if the walls themselves had opened their mouths wide. There was no scream, no fight, just the crushing, suffocating weight of the house as it dragged them into the very walls. And then silence. The house was still. The shadows, once alive with hunger, receded back into the corners, into the crevices of the walls. The air, once thick with dread and terror, grew still again. The house had finished its meal. Outside, the sky was dark, as it had been for days now, but there was no sign of the family, no sign of their voices. Only the empty house, silent in the cold night, sitting quietly in the middle of nowhere, as if waiting for its next visitors to wander through its doors. And the walls. The walls would never stop listening. It had been almost a week since she moved into the apartment. The place was quiet, so quiet that sometimes it felt unnatural. The kind of quiet that wrapped around you like a thick fog, pulling you down into its depths until you could barely breathe. The air smelled faintly of dust, of things left unused for too long. It was the kind of apartment you found in old towns, ones that had stories to tell if you were brave enough to listen. The kind of place where the past never truly let go. She wasn't sure if that was what had drawn her to the building in the first place. The isolation, the way the structure seemed to lean back into the earth, as if it had grown there, rooted deep, its old bones settled into the ground. She'd been looking for something different, something that would give her the chance to begin again, far from the chaos of the city. The apartment was cheap, almost too cheap, but there was no denying that it was perfect in its simplicity. It was small, just a single room with a narrow kitchen and a tiny bathroom, but it was all hers. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. At first, she didn't notice the man. Her neighbors were quiet. The building was old, and like most old buildings, it had its creaks and groans, its whispers and sighs as the wind battered its aging frame. But then, as the days dragged on, she began to hear him. The silent man. It was always at night, after the world outside had settled into its own slumber. The soft shuffling, the slow dragging of footsteps across the floor, the occasional creak of a chair, or the clink of something being set down. The sounds came from the apartment next door, and although she'd never once seen the man, she knew exactly where they came from. The old man had been in the building longer than she had. He was a fixture, a shadow that passed through the halls without ever truly being seen. The landlord had warned her about him when she first signed the lease. "He doesn't leave his room much," he'd said, with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just keep to yourself, and you'll never have a problem." The man's door was always closed, locked, maybe, but she'd never heard it open. She had never seen him step out into the hallway, never heard the shuffling of his feet in the lobby. There were no voices, just silence. But the sounds, those strange, unsettling sounds, persisted every night like clockwork. And every morning it was as though nothing had ever happened. At first, she tried to ignore it. It was just an old building after all. Houses creaked, floors settled, pipes groaned in the night. But there was something about the way those sounds lingered in the quiet, stretching out far beyond their natural limits, that made her uneasy. Sometimes she would hear a faint tap, like the tapping of fingernails against the wall. Other times there was a low hum, like someone muttering under their breath. It was subtle, almost as though she was imagining it, but it was always there. Always. It was the whispers that unsettled her most. She'd been sitting on her bed one evening reading when she first noticed it. A soft murmur, a faint rustling sound coming through the walls. She couldn't make out any words, but she could feel the presence of something alive on the other side of her wall. The whispers tugged at her thoughts, pulling her attention away from the pages of her book. She listened harder, straining to hear. Nothing. She frowned and returned to her reading, but the sound had returned, just as faint, just as elusive, drifting through the thin walls. It was a low murmur, the kind of whisper that seemed to be teasing, pulling you closer, beckoning you to listen. She stared at the wall, wondering if it was just the wind outside playing tricks on her. But when she looked out the window, the night was still. The wind had died down hours ago. There were no more sounds from the street, only the whispering. Curiosity gnawed at her, tugging at the edge of her mind. What was that sound, and who was it coming from? She knew the old man was there, in his room, on the other side of the wall, but this was something else. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't just the soft shuffle of feet across the floor, or the occasional clink of a chair. No, these whispers were intentional. They were spoken. She couldn't stop herself. She needed to know what it was. The next day, when she left her apartment to buy groceries, she found herself lingering in the hallway outside his door. It was a strange feeling, this desire to know something about him. She had never met him, not even once, and yet she felt as if she had been hearing him for days, like a presence in her life that she couldn't quite escape. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of space between the wooden frame and the door itself. She could see the faint light of a bulb glowing from the crack, casting a pale, yellowish glow on the floor. Her heart thudded in her chest, her breath quickening as she looked at the door. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. For a moment, she considered turning away, going back to her own apartment. She didn't need to know. She didn't need to intrude. But the curiosity, that gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach, told her otherwise. She reached for the door handle, and just as her fingers brushed against it, she froze. The air in the hallway grew thick with something she couldn't put her finger on, a sensation that pressed against her skin like a cold hand. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She glanced down the hall to make sure no one was watching, but there was nothing. The building was still. She pushed the door open just a little further. Her breath caught in her throat. The room was pristine. It wasn't what she had expected at all. She had imagined a dark, cluttered space filled with old furniture, dust-covered shelves, and the remnants of a life spent alone. Instead, there was nothing like that. The room was immaculate, an almost unnatural level of cleanliness. The bed was made with exacting care, the sheets tucked in tight. The floor was polished wood, gleaming as if freshly scrubbed. On the far wall, a small antique chair sat by the window, a single potted plant resting beside it. There was no sign of life, no personal touches, no objects that would suggest an old man lived here. And yet she knew he did. She could feel it in her gut. The door was ajar, and yet there was no sign of the man, no sign of movement, not even a sound. She stepped inside, her footsteps barely making a sound on the smooth floor. It was as though the room had been frozen in time, a space where nothing ever moved. But the whispers were louder now. They were no longer faint, no longer distant. They echoed through the room, not coming from any specific corner, but reverberating off the walls, seeming to rise from the very air itself. It was a strange, unsettling sound, a low murmur that didn't quite belong to any human voice. It was the sound of something unnatural, something that shouldn't be there. She stood there, her mind racing, unsure of what to do next. Her hand hovered over the door, ready to close it and run. But she couldn't leave. Not now. The whispers were too loud, too close. And then she saw it. There, in the corner of the room, something moved. It wasn't the old man, not exactly. It was a shadow, a figure that flickered just out of her sight. When she turned her head to look directly at it, it was gone. But she knew. She knew something was in the room with her. Something not human. The whispers grew louder. She took a step back. And then a voice that wasn't her own, spoke from the shadows. "Leave now." The voice echoed through the room, its words slicing through the heavy silence like a knife. The room felt colder, an oppressive chill seeping into her bones as she turned, slowly, toward the shadows in the corner. Her heart pounded in her chest. The voice, it was so clear, so unmistakably real. Leave now. But where was it coming from? She could still see the flicker of the shadow, the way it slithered in the corner of her vision, just beyond reach, as if it was teasing her, daring her to look closer. Her breath caught in her throat. The room around her was perfectly still, too still. No sign of life, no sound, save for the whispering, which had grown louder, more insistent. It wrapped around her like tendrils, making her skin prickle with a sudden awareness that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her legs trembled beneath her. She shouldn't have come in here. She shouldn't have let curiosity drive her. But now that she was here, now that she'd seen the pristine emptiness of the room, the unnatural stillness, she couldn't just turn away. She couldn't leave without knowing what was happening. The whispers wouldn't let her. They demanded to be heard. Leave now. The voice was stronger now, more commanding. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the words, as if the very air was being squeezed tighter around her, forcing her to listen, to obey. She stepped back, but her foot snagged on the edge of the rug, sending her stumbling toward the center of the room. Her breath quickened. She steadied herself, but it was too late. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, making her heart leap into her throat. She spun around, panic surging through her veins. The door had been open, she was sure of it. But now it was closed, locked from the inside. The walls seemed to hum with the energy of the house, vibrating under the weight of the silence. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen, staring at the door, as if willing it to open. But it didn't. She wasn't alone, and she couldn't escape. Not yet. The whispers, those damn whispers, grew louder. And now there was a new sound mixed in, a scraping noise, faint at first, then slowly building. It was the sound of something dragging, something moving. Her pulse quickened. Her head whipped around the room, eyes searching for the source of the noise. The room was still as a tomb, the air thick with anticipation. The shadows in the corner seemed to be shifting now, twisting, reaching out toward her, as if beckoning her forward. "Stop it!" she whispered to herself, but her voice barely broke the tension. The whispers didn't stop. The scratching noise didn't stop. If anything, it only grew more persistent, as though the house itself was beginning to stir. And then there it was again, the voice. "Leave now!" This time, the voice was not a whisper. It was a command, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to resonate deep inside her chest, vibrating in the very bones of her body. It felt wrong, all of it. The air, the whispers, the shadows. Something about it made her skin crawl, her mind reel. She had to get out. She knew she had to leave. With shaking hands, she fumbled at the door handle, her fingers slipping as the cold metal bit into her skin. Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she struggled against the unseen force that seemed to be holding the door shut. The whispers grew louder, the scraping sound growing more frantic, until it felt as though the very walls themselves were closing in on her. And then finally the door opened. She stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, her pulse thundering in her ears. She pressed her back against the cold wall, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. Her mind was a swirl of panic, of confusion. What had just happened? What had she seen in that room? The old man's room, empty, pristine, untouched. Yet the whispers had been real. The voice had been real. The door to her own apartment was just down the hall. But she didn't feel safe there, not anymore. Not when she knew that something had been watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. It didn't make sense. She tried to piece it all together, but every thought felt jagged, incomplete. She needed to sleep. She needed to think, but the image of that room, the pristine space where no one had been, kept flashing in her mind. The voice. "Leave now." What does it want? Before she could turn to go back to her apartment, the sound came again. This time louder, the scraping like nails on wood. It was unmistakable. It was coming from the apartment, the old man's apartment, the one she'd just left. The whispers, too, were still there, layered beneath the scraping, swirling like an insidious fog. She froze. She shouldn't go back in there, not now, not after what she'd just experienced, but she couldn't help herself. With a quick glance down the hall, she crept back toward the door. The hallway was empty as it always was. The building seemed quiet, almost too quiet. There was no sound from other apartments, nothing to indicate that anyone else was awake or even there. Just the same heavy silence. When she reached the door, her heart pounded in her chest. It had been locked before. But now it was slightly ajar, just a crack. She stood there for a moment, her hand trembling in the air, unsure whether she should push it open. But curiosity won. She pushed the door slowly, and it creaked open, just wide enough for her to slip inside. The room was the same as it had been before, neat, empty, pristine. But there was something different now, something new. The whispers were louder, clearer, as if the room itself was speaking. She felt it then, the presence. Something was here. She could feel it on the back of her neck, a pressure in the air, a weight that pressed against her chest. The shadows moved again, but this time it wasn't just the flicker of light. The shadows twisted and formed shapes, shapes with eyes. A low, guttural rasp escaped from the dark corner. A figure. But it wasn't the old man, it was something else. She could barely breathe as the shadows formed into a shape, tall and imposing, its features indistinct, blurred like smoke. Its eyes, those eyes, pierced through her. They were empty, hollow, but they saw her. "You should have listened," the voice rasped, rising from the darkness. And then she saw it. The old man's face, twisted in agony, emerging from the shadows. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream, but it was clear. He was no longer the man she thought he was. He had been swallowed by whatever this thing was. Her legs gave out beneath her as she fell to the floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the door slammed shut again. The whispers began anew, louder, closer. "You should have listened," they echoed. The room felt like a prison now, the walls pressing in around her. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened with each passing second, the air thick, as if the very atmosphere had turned against her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to steady herself, but it was no use. The whispers, low and taunting, wrapped themselves around her like cold fingers. "You should have listened," the voice murmured again, but this time it wasn't coming from just one direction. It was everywhere, swirling through the air like smoke, slipping under her skin. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but the shadows had deepened. The walls were no longer the same. They were shifting, breathing, alive. She could hear them, feel them, as if they were drawing her into their suffocating embrace. And then there were those eyes. They were everywhere, watching, waiting, judging. The eyes were not human. They were something darker, something older. Black pits in the swirling shadows, glinting with an unnatural hunger. They seemed to pierce through her, making her skin crawl, her legs tremble with fear. She couldn't look away, even though she wanted to. She couldn't escape them. Her throat tightened, a scream bubbling up inside of her, but she bit it back. She couldn't. She wouldn't let them hear her. The shadows would hear her, and the whispers would grow louder, more insistent. She had to get out. But the door, it was locked. Again. It didn't matter how many times she tried. The damn door wouldn't open. She pounded on it, the sound of her fists striking the wood, loud and frantic, but it was no use. The door didn't budge. It felt as though something had solidified in the room, pressing against her, every movement preventing her from leaving. There was no escape. And then, just as she felt her strength falter, as her thoughts started to scatter and fade, something new happened. A low rumble, almost like a growl, echoed from deep within the room. The air grew colder, colder still, as though the room itself had dropped several degrees in mere seconds. It wasn't the air. It was the presence in the room. The thing that had taken the old man. The thing that had been watching her, whispering to her. The shadows began to stretch toward her, reaching, twisting, as if they were becoming something more, something solid. It was the first time she saw them move. It wasn't the shadows themselves, it was the thing within them. A shape was emerging from the dark, a figure growing slowly but surely. It had no distinct form, no clear outline, just an overwhelming presence that seemed to consume the room. The whispers grew louder until they were deafening. The growls grew deeper, more primal. The eyes, those awful eyes, were the first thing she noticed. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were real. They glowed faintly in the dark, like coals in a dying fire. They were hungry eyes, eyes that had seen too much and wanted more. "Leave now!" The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command. It was all around her now, and the force behind it made her body shake, her legs quiver, her breath catch in her throat. She stepped backward, panic flooding her chest as she backed into the wall, her hands desperately searching for purchase. But there was no escape. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the eyes, they were everywhere. "Leave now." The voice was no longer the same as before. It was darker, gravelly, deeper, a tone that sent ice through her veins. It wasn't the old man's voice anymore. It couldn't be. It was something else. It was the thing inside him. The thing that had been hiding behind the door all this time, waiting, growing stronger with each passing day. A figure was emerging from the shadows now, but it wasn't the old man. Not anymore. Number. It was something far worse. It had the shape of a person, but it wasn't human. The silhouette was too tall, too slender. The limbs were elongated, stretched unnaturally long, as though they were still growing, still reaching out for something. The face, if it could even be called a face, was a mass of dark shadows and shifting features. It had no eyes, but the blackness within the shape seemed to see her. It knew her. She couldn't look away, she couldn't move. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a command, it was a question. "Why did you come here?" It was a question that cut deep into her soul, one that made her stomach twist with something primal. She didn't know how to answer it. How could she? She hadn't come here to find this, whatever this was. She hadn't come looking for the things that lurked in the dark corners of this room. But it didn't matter. The thing in front of her knew. It knew everything. "You shouldn't have come." The words were sharp, cold, and they hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. She could feel them in her chest, a pressure building that made her breath stutter, her heart stop beating for a single, agonizing moment. Then, without warning, the creature lunged forward, its body contorted as it stretched and reached, its limbs moving like liquid shadows, fast and unnatural. She barely had time to scream before it was upon her. It wasn't flesh, it wasn't blood, it was something else entirely. A darkness that seemed to suck the light out of the room, pulling everything into itself. The air grew heavier as it wrapped itself around her, and she felt her body becoming numb, the sensation slipping from her fingertips as if she were being drained of her very essence. "No!" she gasped, but the word was swallowed by the darkness, sucked into the void where her voice couldn't escape. The room spun, the shadows closing in, and she found herself falling into the blackness, into the abyss that seemed to be waiting for her. She couldn't see any more. There was only darkness. Only the feel of the shadows wrapping tighter and tighter around her, choking the breath from her lungs. And then, for a split second, just before the darkness took her completely, she heard something. A voice. A whisper. But it wasn't the thing in front of her. It wasn't the creature that had taken the old man. It was his voice. The old man's voice. "Run, before it takes you to—" The cold pressed against her skin, a suffocating force that stole her breath and numbed her mind. She didn't know how long she'd been falling. Time had become irrelevant. The darkness swallowed her whole, erasing every sensation but the pounding of her heart. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the old man's voice, the words, "Run, before it takes you too," a whispered plea that had barely registered in her panicked mind. But now, in the crushing void of blackness, there was only silence. And the whispering. Always the whispering. It filled her ears, swirling around her like smoke. But it wasn't a gentle whisper. No, it was urgent, desperate, like a dozen voices all trying to break free at once. They choked her, smothering her with a weight that pressed down on her chest, suffocating her thoughts. "You should have listened." The voice hissed, the words more twisted, more vengeful. The shadows that had consumed her seemed to close in tighter, their presence becoming unbearable, filling every crevice of her mind. Her hands trembled, reaching out for something, anything to ground herself. But there was nothing. No floor, no walls, no light. Just a boundless void, a nothingness that threatened to consume her whole. Suddenly a sharp crack, like a whip, cut through the silence. The air around her shifted, and for the first time she felt movement. Something was moving within the darkness. Something was watching. A cold shiver ran down her spine as her feet touched something solid, the floor materializing beneath her. But she didn't dare look down. She knew what was there. She could feel it, an oppressive weight, a presence that breathed with the same rancid air. It wasn't her moving anymore. It was something else, guiding her, pulling her. Her legs moved against her will, dragging her forward through the suffocating void. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't control her body. Her mind screamed for her to run, to fight. It was as if she were no longer in command. The whispers rose again, louder this time, insistent, forcing their way into her skull. Their voices twisted, layered over one another, melding into a singular, garbled chant that pounded inside her head. Come closer, you can't escape. She stumbled, tripping over the unseen floor as the voices erupted into a deafening roar, their cold breath rushing past her ears, brushing against her skin like icy fingers. And then, in the distance, just before the darkness became overwhelming, a flicker of light appeared. It was dim, barely noticeable at first, but it grew as she was dragged toward it. It was a doorway, framed in shadows that stretched and quivered as if alive, waiting to devour her. But there was something in that light. Something that promised safety. Or so she hoped. Her body lurched forward, moving of its own accord as the darkness receded around her. The light became brighter, clearer, until the shape of a door emerged. She could barely make out the details, but it was a doorway, a way out. Or at least, it looked like one. "Leave me be," she murmured, barely able to speak, the words thick with fear and desperation. The darkness didn't care. The whispering didn't care. They didn't want her to leave. They wanted her to stay, wanted her to be theirs. The door was just ahead now, its handle cold and slick with fear, but her trembling hand reached out. The moment her fingers brushed against the metal, the whispers ceased, replaced with a silence so profound, so deep, that it felt as though her very thoughts had been stilled. The absence of sound was deafening. She gripped the handle with all the strength she had left. She pulled, and it opened. The light flooded in. Her lungs drew in a sharp breath, a gasp as the light wrapped around her, filling her vision with blinding intensity. Her eyes squinted against the overwhelming brightness, struggling to make sense of what she saw. For a moment, she thought she was free, but then the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She spun around, panic rising in her chest. The light, the doorway, had vanished. She was back in the same room, the same place, the same thing. But now it wasn't just the shadows that moved. The air around her crackled with energy, thick with malevolent force. The thing was near. She could feel it. Its presence was pressing against her, suffocating her thoughts. And now, more than ever, she understood it. It was not a physical entity, not something that could be seen or touched. It was the darkness itself, the manifestation of all that was wrong in this world, feeding off her fear, her desperation, her very soul. The whispers began again, rising from the walls, from the floor, from the very air she breathed. But this time, the words were different. "You can't leave." The voice, still unfamiliar but now unmistakable, sent a shockwave of terror through her. It was a soundless scream that clawed its way into her brain, dragging her deeper into the shadows. "No, no, please!" She wanted to scream, to cry out, to fight, but her voice was lost, drowned in the ocean of whispers. The room closed in on her, warping, shifting, bending in unnatural ways. Her body jerked forward, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. She stumbled but couldn't fall. The whispers now filled her thoughts entirely, a swarm of jagged, fragmented voices clawing at her mind, demanding, pleading, commanding, "You belong here, you belong to us." Her pulse quickened, her breathing shallow. She tried to turn away, to push back, but the shadows kept pressing in, swirling tighter, heavier, suffocating her with their endless hungry hunger. And then, just as her vision began to blur, she heard it, the sound of movement. It was faint, distant at first, but unmistakable. A shuffling, a scraping, someone was moving in the dark, and it was coming closer, closer. "You've been warned." The words rattled through her head, spoken by a voice that was cold, hollow. She tried to look around, but everything was a blur, the shadows all-consuming, the air too thick with the weight of her terror. The noise grew louder and closer, and then she saw it, the shape of a figure, tall, hunched, its movements slow, deliberate. The old man's face appeared again, only this time his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring into her soul. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The thing in the shadows was no longer the old man. It was something else. It was the thing that had always been waiting. The thing that had always been watching. The old man's eyes, wide open but empty, stared at her with an intensity that sent a cold wave crashing through her. She couldn't look away. It wasn't that she didn't want to. She couldn't. There was something compelling about those eyes, as though they were pulling her in, drawing her closer to the truth, to the very heart of the darkness that had enveloped the room. And then it moved. It wasn't the old man, not anymore. What was standing before her wasn't human. It was a twisted mockery of the man that had once lived in the apartment. His face, if it could even be called that, was a mess of gnarled skin stretched and pulled into grotesque shapes, with hollow, blackened eyes and a mouth that was far too wide. It smiled at her, but there was no joy in it, only a hollow hunger. It was laughing, and as the sound filled the room, no, as it filled her head, she felt her limbs go numb. The whispers, once a distant hum, were now a cacophony, crashing down on her, drowning her in their noise. The walls trembled, the air buzzed with a suffocating pressure. She was trapped in this nightmare, and the worst part? It was starting to feel real. The thing in front of her stepped closer, its limbs stretching out at unnatural angles. Its fingers were too long, curling like claws, reaching for her. She wanted to run. She tried to scream, but the sound was lodged deep in her throat, as if her body had forgotten how to make a sound. She wanted to run, but the darkness wouldn't let her. It was everywhere now, twisting and warping, curling around her like a living thing. "You should never have opened that door," the creature crooned, its voice slithering around her like smoke. "Now you belong to us." "No." Her voice was barely a whisper, a broken thing, as though the shadows had stolen all her strength. She tried to move, but it was like trying to swim through molasses. The air had thickened to a point where she could hardly breathe, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The room seemed to grow smaller, more suffocating, the walls closing in as the thing continued to move closer, its eyes never leaving hers. The air stank of rot, of something ancient and decayed, and the cold, that same icy chill that had been chasing her since she first stepped foot into this cursed apartment, was now biting into her bones. She had to escape, but she couldn't. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The creature was so close now, its face only inches away from hers. She could feel its breath, cold and damp against her skin, and as it opened its mouth to speak, the room seemed to vibrate with the force of the words that came next. "You have no place here anymore." The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. They vibrated through her body, reverberated in her chest, rattling her bones. And with those words, the creature's clawed hand shot out and gripped her wrist, its touch like ice, its fingers sinking into her flesh as though it were tearing her apart from the inside. A scream tore from her throat, a sound she didn't know she was capable of, but no one would hear it. The building was silent, the world outside oblivious to the horror she was enduring. The thing pulled her toward it, and she had no choice but to let it. Her body was no longer her own. She felt her feet dragging against the floor, her body sliding toward the creature that had once been the old man. It was as if she were sinking into the ground, her very soul being drawn out of her body, inch by inch. The whispers, those damn whispers, they were everywhere. Inside her mind, inside her skin. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the thing that was feeding on her very existence. And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume her completely, she saw it. The door she had opened only moments before. It was standing there, still, bathed in the faintest flicker of light. It was no longer a doorway to freedom, no longer a symbol of escape. Now it was the last shred of hope in a room filled with nightmares, but she couldn't reach it. No matter how hard she tried, her limbs refused to obey. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the creature's grip. "You belong to me now." The words were not just spoken aloud, they ripped through her soul. Every muscle, every bone, every ounce of her being screamed in defiance, but there was nothing she could do. The creature's grip tightened, its fingers sinking deeper, and with it, her very essence began to slip away. Her mind went blank, number. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. She wasn't supposed to be trapped here. She wasn't supposed to lose everything, to fade away into the darkness that had taken the old man, that had always been here, lurking in the silence. But then there was a sound, a thump, the faintest vibration in the floor beneath her feet, a voice echoing from somewhere deep within the building. Familiar? No, not familiar, but it was a voice, a warning. Leave, before it takes you too. The old man's voice. Her heart stuttered, her vision blurred, but the words sliced through the fog in her mind like a lifeline. She didn't know how it was possible, didn't know how it was even here, but there it was, a chance, a sliver of hope. And with that sliver of hope, she forced herself to move. The darkness clung to her, dragging her back, pulling her into its depths, but with every ounce of strength she had left, she fought. Her limbs screamed in protest, but she pushed through, inch by inch. Her fingers brushed the edge of the door. The whispers screamed louder, the creature hissed in fury, but she didn't stop. She shoved the door open with the last of her strength, the sound of it creaking like a dying breath. And as she stumbled through, she found herself back in the hallway, gasping for air. It wasn't over. The thing was still there, still watching her, but for the first time, she wasn't bound to it. She wasn't part of it. She ran, but she knew it would follow. It was a cold, foggy morning when the call came. The kind of morning that clung to you like a heavy cloak, making every step feel weighed down with unease. The phone rang in the quiet house, breaking the stillness, and the voice on the other end was familiar, but strained. "It's Aunt Clara," the voice said. "I have something for you, something for the baby." The couple had been expecting their first child for months, and like any new parents, they had been excited to gather the essentials. But this was different. "Clara, we're fine, really," the woman replied, glancing at the cribs they had already set up in the nursery, the fresh coat of pastel blue on the walls. Crib wasn't something they had needed from anyone else. "It's not just any crib," Aunt Clara interrupted, her voice tightening with something the woman couldn't quite place. "It's an heirloom. It's been in the family for generations. You need it." The woman paused, uneasy. There was always something about Aunt Clara that made her skin prickle. "Well, we have one already." "No." Clara's voice was firm now, insistent. "You don't understand. This crib, it's special. Come by and take it. It's waiting for you." After a long silence, the woman finally gave in, agreeing to pick it up the next day. The way Clara had spoken left a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. The stories her aunt always told about the past, the ones she had once dismissed as nonsense, suddenly didn't feel so far-fetched. But she brushed it off. It was just a crib. It couldn't be anything more than that. The next day, the couple made the long drive to the isolated farmhouse at the edge of town. The house stood like something out of a forgotten memory, shrouded in fog, surrounded by thick trees, its windows dark and uninviting. As they approached, the woman's unease grew, but she pressed on, not wanting to disappoint Aunt Clara. The house creaked as they stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Clara was waiting for them, her frame thin and angular in the doorway, as if she had been standing there for hours. "You made it?" Clara said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The crib's out back. I'll show you." The woman followed Clara around the side of the house, her curiosity growing with every step. When they reached the backyard, Clara gestured toward a large bundle wrapped in old, faded blankets. "There it is," Clara said softly, almost reverently. The woman couldn't help but feel a chill as her eyes fell on the object. The crib was ancient, dark, polished wood, its surface etched with intricate patterns that looked more like scars than decorations. It was small, far smaller than the crib they had already prepared, but it was unsettlingly well preserved. Despite the years it had clearly seen, the crib looked as if it had been polished just that morning. "It's beautiful," the woman said, trying to mask her discomfort. She glanced at her partner, who was already crouching to inspect the crib. "It's definitely old," he commented, running a hand along the surface. "But it seems solid enough. What's the story with this thing?" Clara's eyes darkened. "It's been in the family for generations," she replied, her voice low. "But there are some things that don't get talked about. Just take it, and don't ask too many questions. It's best left undisturbed." The couple exchanged a brief glance, the woman unsure of what to make of Clara's words. Something about the whole situation felt off, but Clara was insistent, and the woman didn't want to make a scene. "All right," the woman said, nodding slowly. "We'll take it." That evening, after the crib had been set up in the nursery, the woman found herself staring at it, unsure of what was pulling her attention. The air in the room was thick, almost oppressive, and the crib seemed to loom larger in the dim light. Its carvings looked sharper now, as if they had somehow grown more intricate in the few hours since they had brought it inside. The woman shivered and turned to her partner, who was sitting on the bed, reading something on his phone. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, offering a reassuring smile. "It's just an old crib. Maybe there's a bit of family history attached, but it's harmless. We'll clean it up a bit, and it'll be fine. Don't worry so much." She nodded, but the unease that had settled in her chest didn't go away. It had only deepened since they set the crib down in the corner of the room. Every time she glanced over at it, something felt wrong. That night, as they prepared for bed, the house seemed unusually quiet. No creaks from the old floors, no distant murmurs, just silence. As the woman lay in bed, drifting off to sleep, she heard it, the faintest sound, barely noticeable at first, but growing louder the more she focused on it. It sounded like a baby's cry, Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding. The house was dark, with the only light coming from the moon that filtered through the window. She listened, straining to hear it again, but there was nothing, just the eerie quiet of the house. She lay there for a while, waiting, trying to convince herself it was nothing. It was just her mind playing tricks, the weight of the crib's presence finally getting to her. But then she heard it again, a cry, this time louder, more distinct, coming from the nursery. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to her partner, but he was already fast asleep, completely unaware. She got up slowly, each step heavier than the last. The house seemed to shift, the walls narrowing around her, pressing in as she made her way toward the nursery. When she opened the door, the room was just as it had been before, empty, still, and silent. The crib was in the corner, untouched, and there was no sign of any crying, just the shadows of the room stretching long across the floor. But the feeling, the weight of something unseen, was stronger now. She couldn't shake it. Was she imagining it? Was it the stress of pregnancy, the anticipation? Or was there something truly wrong with that crib? As she closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for the baby. When the sun rose the next morning, the house seemed normal. The usual creaks and groans of old floorboards were present, and the sunlight filtered through the curtains in soft beams, spilling across the worn wooden floorboards. The nursery looked as serene as ever, the crib resting in the corner like an innocent object. But despite the daylight, the unease lingered, still pressing down on the woman's chest. She tried to push the strange, nagging feeling out of her mind. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She was just adjusting to the changes that came with expecting her first child. It wasn't unusual to feel a little unsettled. Yet the memory of the cry from the night before haunted her, echoing through her thoughts. Had she imagined it? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she had heard something real, something otherworldly. She wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the house or the weight of the crib itself made it feel so alive, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Her partner didn't seem to notice any of it. He was already deep into his daily routine, busy with work, with the preparations for the baby. He made no comment about the crib, just as he hadn't reacted to her concerns the night before. "I'll grab breakfast," he called out from the kitchen, his voice steady, normal, unaffected. "You should get some rest. I know you haven't been sleeping well." The woman nodded absently. She wasn't sure if it was the pregnancy that made her feel drained, or if it was something else entirely, but her exhaustion felt deeper than usual. She felt as though something was draining her, pulling her energy away, leaving her hollow. But she had to shake it off. She couldn't let herself get caught up in imagined fears. After breakfast, as she wandered through the house, cleaning and preparing for the arrival of the baby, the feeling of being watched never fully dissipated. The nursery door remained slightly ajar, as though it had been left that way on purpose. When she passed by, her gaze would fall on the crib, still standing in the same spot, perfectly still, almost too still. At first, it was easy to dismiss the small oddities, the low hum in the walls, the drafts that seemed to swirl in the nursery, even though all the windows were shut tight. But the more she tried to ignore them, the louder they grew. Her mind raced. She hadn't believed the stories Aunt Clara had told when she was younger, the ones about spirits tied to old things, to heirlooms that were never meant to be passed on. But now, with the crib in her house, the strange feelings growing day by day, she wasn't so sure anymore. Later that evening, as the woman sat in the living room, flipping through a book on childbirth, she heard something that stopped her cold. a soft whisper, almost imperceptible at first, as though the sound was coming from far away. It was just beyond the threshold of hearing, but it seemed to call her name. She stiffened. "Hello?" she called out, the book falling from her lap. Nothing. The house was silent again, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hall. Her pulse quickened. She felt ridiculous. Surely it was nothing more than the house settling. It had been known to do that, to groan and creak as the weather changed. But the whisper, soft and fleeting, lingered in the back of her mind like an echo she couldn't shake. Then it came again, clearer this time. A soft whisper, followed by a faint giggle. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She jumped to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, but everything appeared calm, undisturbed. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to steady her breath. "Just the house," she muttered, trying to calm herself. "It's old, that's all." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't just the house. The whispers didn't stop. They came and went throughout the night, soft and maddening like a child's breath on the other side of a door. That night, after a restless evening of listening to those whispers, the woman couldn't take it anymore. She had to see for herself. The nursery was dark when she opened the door. The only light came from the sliver of moonlight that crept through the curtains. As her eyes adjusted, she could see the crib still sitting in the corner of the room, exactly as it had been left. She took a cautious step inside, the floor creaking beneath her feet. Her fingers brushed the edges of the crib as she approached it. The wood felt colder than it should have. She shivered, and then she heard it again. A soft, strangled cry. She whipped around, but no one was there. The crib, the walls, the room. It was all empty. The silence was deafening, but the crying continued, low and mournful. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the room toward the crib. There, in the darkness, she could see something. Shadow, barely there, twisting and writhing on the walls. And then, just as quickly as it started, the crying stopped. The room felt cold, not just cold, but wrong. The very air seemed to thicken, as if something were pressing in from all sides. Her breath hitched as she backed away from the crib, the shadow now dancing violently across the walls in a chaotic blur. And then a voice, not a whisper this time, not a child's cry, but a voice, clear. And it spoke one word. Soon. Her blood ran cold. It was as though the word had been spoken directly into her mind, but the sound of it rattled her bones. She spun around, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. There was no one, no child, no spirit. But the room was alive. The woman didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the nursery, pacing back and forth, trying to shake the sense of dread that clung to her skin. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made her jump. The crib, now more than ever, seemed to be calling to her, as though it had a voice of its own. She couldn't tell her partner. He wouldn't believe her. He would think she was just overreacting. But she knew what she had heard. She knew what she had felt. The crib wasn't just a relic of the past. It wasn't just a family heirloom. It was waiting for something to fill the emptiness. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was suffocating, thick, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The woman hadn't slept a wink that night, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. She could still hear the whispers, even in the daylight, faint, like the echoes of a distant memory she couldn't quite place. When she finally ventured into the nursery that morning, the crib stood in its corner just as it had the night before, untouched and still. But it wasn't just the crib that caught her attention. It was the feeling. Something heavy in the air, something pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. The shadows in the room seemed darker than usual, stretching long across the floor as the early sunlight filtered in through the curtains. The woman moved closer, her footsteps hesitant, as though the room itself might lash out at her for disturbing its stillness. And then she saw it. A single handprint smudged against the wood of the crib's side. It was small, faint, but it was unmistakably there. A tiny handprint, fingers splayed wide as if a child had placed their palm against the crib. The mark seemed fresh, as if someone had just touched it moments before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, her hand trembling as she ran her fingers along the edge of the crib. The wood was cold, unnaturally cold, even though the house was warm from the morning sun. It sent a shock through her fingertips, and she pulled her hand back, staring at it as if it had betrayed her. Had someone been in the room? Had she just missed it? Number. She would have heard them. She would have felt them. The mark was undeniable. Her breath quickened, and a surge of panic flooded through her veins. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what was happening. What was the crib trying to tell her? What was it waiting for? She felt the sudden need to get out of the room, but her feet felt like lead. Something held her in place. She tried to force herself to move, to turn away, but it was as if the room had locked her in. The shadows seemed to coil around her, pulling her toward the crib. A soft creak echoed from the other side of the room, and the woman froze, her heart skipping a beat. It came again, creak, and then a whisper. Soon. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was that same voice, the same chilling, guttural whisper that had haunted her the night before. She turned around, eyes darting to the door, but the room was empty. There was no one there, nothing but the crib, standing still and silent in the corner. But the whisper didn't stop. It came again, louder this time, and it sounded almost pleased, like it was waiting for something, like it was anticipating something. Soon, it repeated, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was as if the walls themselves had spoken. The woman stumbled backward, her hand gripping the doorframe to steady herself. Her thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion, spinning faster than she could catch up. What was it? What did it want? She had to get out of there, away from the crib, away from the nursery. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound made her scream, her breath catching in her throat. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the door was welded shut, like the house itself was trapping her inside. Panic surged through her, and she threw herself against the door, pushing with all her strength, but the door refused to open. That's when she heard it, the sound that made her blood run cold. The faintest sound of movement, like someone dragging their feet across the floor, followed by a soft, wet thud. Her head whipped around toward the crib, and there, standing beside it, was a figure. The woman's throat went dry, her body frozen in place. The figure was blurred, indistinct, as if it was barely there, a shadow made flesh. It was small, childlike in form, but its features were hidden, obscured by a darkness that seemed to cling to it. The figure didn't move, it simply stood there, watching her, waiting. The woman's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear the sound of her own pulse, pounding, relentless, as she stared at the figure, willing it to go away, but it didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there in the shadow of the crib. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, sharper. Soon! She wanted to scream, to run, to break the door down and get out of the house, out of that room. But her feet were stuck. She couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step was like a clock ticking, a countdown to something she couldn't comprehend. She opened her mouth to call for help, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, as though it were closing in on itself. The figure moved closer, its dark eyes, if they could be called eyes, focused intently on her, as though it were reading her soul. "Soon," it repeated, its voice echoing in her mind. And then, in an instant, the figure lunged forward. The woman screamed, at least she tried to, but the sound never reached her lips. Everything went dark, as though the room itself had swallowed her whole, and when she woke, she was alone. The door to the nursery was wide open, the shadows now gone. The crib stood in the corner, still and quiet, as though nothing had happened. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the whisper. It was as if it had all been a nightmare. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. A single handprint, small and faint, on the side of the crib. It wasn't her hand. The woman's breath was shallow as she stood frozen in the nursery, staring at the crib. The handprint on its side seemed to be burning into her vision, its presence a cold reminder of the strange happenings that had plagued her since the moment they brought the crib into the house. Was it real? Had she imagined the shadowy figure? The whisper? The terrifying touch of the cold air when she had been trapped in the room? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of panic from her mind. Everything felt out of place, like she was living in someone else's nightmare. The crib, the whispers, the shadows, none of it made sense. "It's just the stress," she told herself. "It's just the pregnancy. I'm tired. I need to rest. That's all it is." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Much more. She couldn't explain it, but something in the air had changed. There was a weight in the house now, something pressing down on her, suffocating her. The house, once an old but comforting space, felt oppressive. The air in the room was too still, too thick, as though the walls themselves were watching her. And the worst part was that she couldn't seem to escape the feeling that the crib, that thing, was waiting for something. Later that day, she called her partner into the nursery, desperate for reassurance. But when he stepped into the room, he didn't seem to notice the shift in the atmosphere. To him, the nursery was just a room, a little colder than usual, perhaps. Nothing more. "You've been spending too much time in here," he said gently, eyeing the crib. "It's just an old crib, right? Nothing to worry about." She looked at him, trying to find the right words, but they felt hollow in her mouth. How could she explain what she was feeling? How could she make him understand the dread that seemed to live in the walls? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It just doesn't feel right." He gave her a puzzled look, but didn't press the matter further. Instead, he placed his hand on her shoulder. "You're probably just overthinking. You're a little stressed about the baby. But we'll be fine." She nodded, but she didn't feel fine. The echo of that whisper, "soon," still rang in her ears. And the handprint, so small, so clear, still lingered in her mind. As the night came, the house seemed to settle into a new kind of quiet. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that held a promise that something was watching, something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, as the woman lay in bed, she heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. The sound of something or someone dragging its feet across the floor. The footsteps seemed to move through the house, circling around her room before disappearing down the hall. They were quiet but unmistakable, like the shuffle of old, worn shoes against wooden floorboards. She held her breath, listening intently, but the footsteps didn't return. Instead, the silence in the house seemed even heavier, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The house had always been quiet, always had its creaks and groans, but this was something different. This wasn't the house settling. This was something moving through the walls, something alive. The woman turned to her partner, who was fast asleep beside her. His breathing was deep and even, unaware of the same sounds that were keeping her awake. She didn't want to wake him, didn't want to make him worry, but she had to know, she had to be sure. Slowly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him. The cold air of the hallway hit her like a slap to the face as she stepped onto the hardwood floor. She crept down the hall, following the sound of the footsteps. The nursery door was slightly open. As she stood in the threshold, her pulse quickened. The room was dark, the only light coming from a sliver of moonlight that filtered in through the curtains. The crib stood in the corner, its wooden frame gleaming eerily in the dim light. The woman held her breath, waiting. And then creak. The crib, for the first time since they had moved in, shifted. Just a slight movement, a slow, deliberate rocking. Her heart stopped. There was no wind, there was no one else in the room. The air was still, but the crib rocked. She stepped forward cautiously, her footsteps soundless on the floor. The rocking continued, slow and rhythmic, as if something invisible were gently pushing it. Her gaze was fixed on the crib, her body frozen in place. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice shaky, barely audible. "Is someone there?" The room was silent. Still, the rocking stopped, but then, again, that whisper. Soon. It was so close, she could feel it. The words seemed to vibrate in her skull, reverberating through her entire body. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She backed away slowly, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She was shaking now, her legs unsteady beneath her. The crib was still, but it wasn't empty. She could feel it. She could feel that something was in there, something that didn't belong, something waiting. And then, as she turned to leave the room, she heard the final sound, a soft, soft cry, a baby's cry. But when she turned back to look at the crib, there was nothing but the shadows. The next morning, the woman found herself standing in front of the crib, staring at it in disbelief. The cry still echoed in her ears, but there was no evidence of it. No sign that anything had happened, no sign of the shadowy figure that had haunted her. Everything seemed normal again, too normal. The air in the room was calm, the crib untouched. But when she looked closer, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A faint, wet streak running down the side of the crib. The wood was damp to the touch, as though it had been recently wiped. She pressed her hand against the wood, her heart racing. The dampness wasn't just water, it felt like something else, something colder. A voice echoed in her mind. Soon. The house felt colder than it ever had before. The weight of the silence was oppressive, a thick, suffocating pressure that seemed to wrap around the woman's chest. She stood in the nursery once again, staring at the crib. No longer just an old piece of furniture, but the heart of the horror that had consumed her life. The crib, untouched, stood in the corner. The wood gleamed in the dim light from the hallway. Yet no matter how many times she told herself it was just an object, just a relic from the past, it felt alive. She could feel its presence, waiting, as though the crib itself was a dark force, slowly, steadily drawing her closer to it. "Soon," the voice echoed in her mind, faint but unmistakable. She felt as though it was always there, lurking in the background of her thoughts, like a constant, haunting refrain. She had tried to ignore it, to move on, to pretend nothing was wrong, but she couldn't. How could she? She wasn't imagining things. The crib, the whispers, the handprints, their presence had all been real, undeniable. She had seen the shadows move, had heard the cries that weren't from any living child. It wasn't just the house, it was the crib itself. She had done everything she could to avoid it, to run from it, but every step she took only seemed to pull her deeper into its dark grip. The presence of something or someone had grown too strong, and she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. The baby was due soon. She should have been excited, should have been preparing for the joy of new life. But all she could think of now was the crib, the cradle that had never truly been empty. She moved closer, her hands trembling as she reached for the side of the crib. It was warm, unnaturally so. The wood, once cold to the touch, now radiated heat, as though it were a living thing. A sudden noise from behind her made her freeze. The faintest sound of movement, a rustling, like the whisper of fabric dragging along the floor. She whipped around, but there was no one there. No shadowy figure, no ghostly presence, just the empty hallway stretching back toward the darkened living room. But the sound didn't stop. The rustling continued, getting louder, more insistent. She turned back to the crib, her eyes wide with terror. The mattress, once pristine, was no longer smooth. It had sagged, as though something had just shifted its weight onto it. A subtle indentation formed in the center of the bed. The woman's breath hitched in her throat, and then the rustling stopped. For a moment there was complete silence, and then a soft cry filled the air. Not a baby's cry, not a cry that belonged to a living child. This was a sound like the scraping of nails against wood, an unearthly, hollow wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the crib itself. The woman staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came from her lips. The room was suddenly too small, too tight. The shadows in the corners seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. She could feel something moving inside the crib. Something, someone was there. The voice spoke again, louder this time. "Soon!" The woman's mind reeled and her body went cold. This was it. This was what the crib had been waiting for. It had been calling to her, drawing her in, preparing for this moment. Whatever was in that crib, it was alive, it was hungry. Her hands reached out, almost of their own accord, to touch the crib once more. She could feel the pulse beneath the wood, the slow, steady thrum of something dark, something ancient. It was as if the crib itself had become a living thing, its own twisted heart beating in time with hers. And then in the blink of an eye, it happened. The mattress bulged as though something beneath it were pressing up from the inside. The sound was deafening now, a scraping, scratching, wet noise, as something inhuman clawed its way toward the surface. The woman stumbled back, her legs weak, unable to hold her. Her back hit the wall and she slid down to the floor, her hands over her ears, but the sound was inescapable. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room was silent again, the crib was still. For a long moment she sat there, her breath shallow and uneven. Her body trembled from the sheer terror that had gripped her. What was it? What had been inside the crib? Slowly, as if her movements were guided by some unseen force, she stood and approached the crib once more. And when she looked inside, she finally understood. Mattress was no longer empty. It was no longer smooth and unmarked. A small, pale hand had appeared in the center of the crib. It wasn't a child's hand. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, too thin, the skin translucent and stretched tight over the bones. The nails were sharp, jagged like claws, and the hand was twitching as if it were testing the air, reaching for something that it could not yet touch. The woman's heart nearly stopped in her chest. Her body refused to move. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She was trapped in the nursery, trapped in this nightmare that had begun with a simple crib. The hand moved again. Slowly, agonizingly slow, it lifted from the mattress, stretching toward the air as if reaching for her. And then, with a final horrible motion, the figure began to pull itself from the crib. The woman's scream filled the house, a raw, unearthly sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. The house was silent once more, and in the crib nothing remained but the faintest traces of the handprint, slowly fading into the wood.